There is something underneath the streets of every major Canadian city that the official history books have never fully explained. Not pipes, not old sewer tunnels, not buried rivers, though those exist too. Something older, something that doesn't fit the timeline we were given in school, the one that says European settlers arrived, cleared the land, and built civilization from scratch on what was supposedly empty wilderness. That story, the one carved into plaques and printed in textbooks, is missing chapters, entire, buried chapters. And once you start pulling at the loose threads, the whole neat narrative begins to unravel in ways that are deeply unsettling, profoundly fascinating, and almost impossible to ignore. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know, where are you right now and what time is it? Picture a crew of construction workers in Toronto, sometime in the early 1900s, digging the foundations for a new building downtown. Their shovels hit something unexpected. Not bedrock, not clay. Something worked. Something shaped by human hands that, by all accounts, should not be there. The city records show nothing. The historians have no explanation. The object gets documented briefly, then disappears into a museum storage room where it will sit for the next 100 years, largely unexamined, because what it implies is too inconvenient for the story being told about this place. This kind of thing happens more than you think. It happens more than anyone in an official capacity wants to admit. And it has been happening in city after city, province after province, for as long as people have been digging into Canadian soil with any kind of mechanical force. Beneath Vancouver's glass towers, beneath Montreal's underground city, beneath the cobblestones of Quebec City, beneath the plains where Calgary now spreads its grid of streets into the prairie, there are layers that don't belong to the history we know. What those layers actually are is a question that opens doors into some of the most contested, most suppressed, and most genuinely mysterious corners of North American archaeology. Tonight we are going to walk through all of it, slowly, without rushing, because this story deserves the time it takes to tell it properly. We are going to talk about what the soil of Canada actually contains, what early excavations found and then quietly buried again in institutional silence, what Indigenous oral traditions have been saying for thousands of years about civilizations that came before, what pre-Columbian contact evidence keeps surfacing in places where it has no business being, and what it might mean that virtually every major Canadian city was, at some point in its modern history, physically raised above its original ground level, with everything that existed before deliberately paved over and forgotten. This is not a story about conspiracy in the way that word usually gets used. This is a story about selective memory, about the way institutions decide what counts as history and what gets classified as an anomaly, about the gap between what the archaeological record actually shows and what makes it into the official narrative, and about the possibility, supported by more evidence than most people realize, that the land now called Canada was host to human activity, sophisticated, organized human activity, far older and far stranger than the story we have been given. So settle in, let the day go. Let whatever was pressing on your mind begin to loosen its grip. We are going to go a very long way back tonight, much further back than the first European ships, much further back than the fur trade and the colonial maps. We are going to go back to a time when the land itself was different, when the ice sheets were still receding, when the rivers ran in different channels, and when people were already here, already living, already building, already leaving marks in the earth that we are only now beginning to understand how to read. And we are going to start in a place that seems, at first, like the least mysterious possible starting point. We are going to start with the streets themselves. The practice of raising city streets is not unique to Canada, but what happened in Canadian cities during the late 1800s and early 1900s was particularly dramatic and particularly thorough. Cities like Toronto, Halifax, St. John and Victoria didn't just resurface their roads, they physically elevated them, in some places by several feet, in others by as much as a full story. The official reasons given were sanitation, flooding control, and the need to accommodate new sewer infrastructure. And those reasons are all technically true, but they don't tell the whole story about what the raising covered up. In Toronto, the original shoreline of Lake Ontario sat considerably north of where it sits today. The entire waterfront district was built on fill, layers of it, added over decades throughout the 1800s and into the early 20th century. Streets that now run along the edge of the lake were, a century ago, underwater or barely above the waterline. And before that, before the fill and the grading and the systematic elevation of the ground level, the original terrain of what would become downtown Toronto had a character that city planners worked very deliberately to erase. There were ravines, there were creek beds, there were wetlands that stretched back from the lake in a way that anyone familiar with the landscape of the Great Lakes region would recognize as exactly the kind of terrain that indigenous peoples have inhabited for thousands of years. These were not empty spaces waiting to be built on. These were occupied territories with their own layered history, going back further than most people in a 19th century planning office were prepared to acknowledge, or, for that matter, to preserve. When the fill went in, when the streets went up, when the foundations were dug for the warehouses and the factories, and the commercial buildings that would become the skeleton of modern Toronto, workers found things. They found hearths. They found middens, the refuse heaps of sustained human occupation, layers of shells and bone and ash that archaeologists recognize immediately as evidence of people living in a place over a long period of time. They found tools made of stone and bone. In some cases, they found what appeared to be structural elements, post holes and floor surfaces, the ghostly impressions of buildings that had stood on that ground before anyone from Europe had ever set foot in North America. Most of what was found was not recorded. Some of it was recorded briefly and then lost in the chaos of rapid development. A small amount made it into museum collections, where it has been sitting ever since, labelled with vague descriptions that undersell what it actually represents. Because what it represents is continuous human occupation of the Toronto region going back not hundreds of years but thousands. In some cases, the artifacts and the soil layers they came from suggest occupation timelines that reach back 8,000 years or more. 8,000 years. That is longer than the entirety of recorded human history in the ancient Near East. It is longer than the period between the founding of the earliest Mesopotamian cities, and right now, the ground beneath downtown Toronto has been a place where humans lived and worked and died for a stretch of time that makes the entire span of what we call Western civilization look like a brief recent episode. And yet the physical act of raising and filling and paving that ground has created a situation where most of what those thousands of years of human activity produced is now inaccessible, sealed under concrete and asphalt and layers of fill, compressed under the weight of the city above, scattered by construction work that had no interest in what it was destroying. The raising of the streets was not a conspiracy to hide indigenous history. It was something arguably more mundane and in some ways more troubling. It was simply indifference. The people doing the building did not think what was underneath mattered, and so they covered it up without a second thought. But here is the thing about what was covered up in Toronto, in Halifax, in St. John, in Victoria, in Vancouver, in every other Canadian city that underwent this process of physical elevation and transformation during the colonial period. Some of it was genuinely strange. Some of it did not fit the timeline that the newly formed scientific and historical institutions of the 19th century were trying to establish. Some of it pointed toward a past that was more complicated, more ancient, and more surprising than anyone officially wanted to deal with. Let's go through some of those cities one by one. Let's look at what was found, what was recorded, what disappeared, and what it might mean. Halifax sits on a peninsula of land that juts into one of the finest natural harbours on the Atlantic coast of North America. The British established a military settlement there in 1749, and from that moment forward, the official history of Halifax begins. Except, of course, it doesn't really begin there at all. The Mi'kmaq people had been using that peninsula and that harbour for thousands of years before any European ship dropped anchor in the Narrows. The Mi'kmaq name for the area, Kjipuktuk, means Great Harbour, and it reflects a relationship with that landscape that goes back to a time before the concept of a harbour in the European navigational sense even existed in human consciousness. When British engineers began fortifying the peninsula and laying out the streets of the new settlement, they worked across ground that was already deeply marked by human activity. The rocky outcroppings that define Halifax's geography, the drumlins and glacially sculpted ridges that give the city its distinctive silhouette, were not blank slates. They were, in a very real sense, occupied, not necessarily in a way that left permanent structures visible at the surface, but occupied in the deeper sense that the land had been shaped, used, understood, and inhabited in an intimate and sustained way for millennia. The area around Bedford Basin, the inner harbour north of the main Halifax Peninsula, contains some of the oldest evidence of human occupation on the Atlantic coast. Archaeological investigations, when they have been allowed to happen, have produced materials suggesting that people were living around that basin during the late Archaic period, a span of time running from roughly 5,000 to 3,000 years before the present. These were not nomadic visitors passing through on a seasonal round. The density and character of the occupation evidence suggests semi-permanent settlement, the kind of sustained presence that begins to look, in some ways, like something more than simple encampment. There are shell middens along the shores of Bedford Basin and along the Dartmouth side of the harbour that contain layers of cultural material spanning hundreds, in some cases thousands, of years of continuous deposition. The things that come out of those middens tell a story about people who were highly sophisticated in their understanding of the marine environment, who were engaged in long-distance trade, and who had a relationship with the land and water of the Halifax region that was anything but simple or primitive. Some of the most interesting finds from the Halifax area, the ones that tend not to make it into popular discussions of the city's history, involve evidence of sustained contact between coastal maritimes populations and other, more distant groups. Trade items made from materials that do not occur naturally in Nova Scotia. Objects whose design characteristics do not match the known typological sequences of Mi'kmaq material culture, but instead point toward connections with cultures much further away, to the south and possibly to the west. The idea that pre-Columbian trade networks were extensive enough to carry material culture from, say, the Ohio Valley or the Chesapeake region all the way to the coast of Nova Scotia should not be surprising. We know from well-documented archaeological evidence that Hopewell period cultures of the Ohio Valley, which flourished roughly 2,000 years ago, were engaged in exchange networks that spanned an enormous portion of eastern North America. Copper from Lake Superior, mica from the Appalachians, marine shells from the Gulf Coast. All of these materials moved through Hopewell exchange networks across distances that seem almost impossible for people without wheeled transport or written trade records. And yet it happened. The archaeological evidence is unambiguous. What is less well known and less frequently discussed is the extent to which those networks may have reached into what is now Atlantic Canada. The conventional picture of pre-Columbian Nova Scotia tends to focus on the Mi'kmaq in relative isolation, as a coastal maritime culture, sophisticated within its own sphere, but essentially disconnected from the broader patterns of social complexity and long-distance exchange that were developing in other parts of the continent. But some of what has been found in and around Halifax, and more broadly across Nova Scotia, suggests that picture may be significantly incomplete. And then there is the question of what lies beneath Halifax itself. The city's original street grid was established on ground that had to be substantially modified to support it. The peninsula's natural topography was rocky and irregular, with areas of boggy ground between the drumlins and exposed bedrock in others. The process of building the city involved cutting and filling, regrading, and eventually raising entire sections of the street network to achieve the uniformity that urban commerce requires. Water Street, the oldest street in Halifax running along the harbour front, has been raised and rebuilt multiple times. Each rebuild buried what was there before. What was there before is a question that has never been fully answered, in part because the pace of development during Halifax's formative period was simply too rapid to allow for any systematic archaeological investigation of what was being disturbed. By the time anyone with the inclination and training to look carefully at what the construction crews were turning up had arrived on the scene, most of what had been there was already gone, crushed under new foundations, or carted away as fill. What survives in the archives, in the notes of early observers, in the collections of the Nova Scotia Museum, suggests a picture of the Halifax Peninsula as a place with a very long human history, a history that the physical act of building the city systematically erased, while simultaneously, almost accidentally, preserving traces of it in the places where development didn't quite reach. Move west along the coast of what European colonizers called British North America, and you arrive eventually at the mouth of the Street. Lawrence, the enormous river that drains the interior of the continent into the Atlantic and that served, for thousands of years before European contact, as one of the great natural highways of pre-Columbian North America. Quebec City sits on a promontory above the narrowing of the St. Lawrence, the point where the river, which is essentially an inland sea further downstream, compresses between cliffs and begins to take on the character of a river in the conventional sense. Champlain founded the French settlement there in 1608. The city that grew from that settlement is the oldest continuously inhabited city in what is now Canada, which is to say, it has been continuously inhabited by people of European descent since 1608. The actual continuous history of human occupation on that promontory is considerably longer. The Iroquoian-speaking people, whom Jacques Cartier encountered when he came up the river in 1534 and 1535, had a large settlement at what is now the location of modern Montreal. Cartier called it Hochelaga. By the time Champlain arrived 70 years later, Hochelaga was gone. The people who had lived there had dispersed, for reasons that are still debated among historians and archaeologists. Some scholars argue for epidemic disease, introduced by Cartier's contact, decimating the population before Champlain arrived. Others suggest internal political upheaval among the Iroquoian groups of the region. Others point to the possibility of significant conflict with neighboring peoples. Whatever the cause, the disappearance of Hochelaga is one of the great unsolved mysteries of St. Lawrence Valley history. But Hochelaga was not the oldest layer of human activity in the region. The archaeological record of the Quebec City area goes back very much further than the Iroquoian-speaking peoples whom the French encountered. Beneath the foundations of Old Quebec, beneath the cobblestone streets of the lower town that were built and rebuilt through the colonial period, there are traces of a much longer human story. The promontory that French engineers called Cap Diamant, the great rocky cliff that gives Quebec City its dramatic silhouette above the river, was known to the indigenous peoples of the region as a significant landmark long before any European named it. The strategic advantages of that position, the view up and down the river, the natural defensibility, the access to the river below, would have been as obvious to people 10,000 years ago as they were to Champlain in 1608. And the archaeological evidence, where it has been recovered, suggests that people recognized and used those advantages across a very long stretch of time. Some of the most intriguing material from the Quebec City region, and from the St. Lawrence Valley more broadly, relates to what archaeologists call the St. Lawrence Iroquoian culture and its predecessors. The St. Lawrence Iroquoians were not simply a localized adaptation of the broader Iroquoian tradition. They had their own distinctive material culture, their own settlement patterns, their own ways of organizing social and political life. And they were producing, in the period roughly between 1000 and 1535 CE, a degree of social complexity that many popular accounts of pre-Columbian Canada fail to adequately convey. Their villages were large, some of the larger St. Lawrence Iroquoian settlements that have been investigated archaeologically covered several hectares and contained longhouses capable of housing dozens of people each. The population of a significant St. Lawrence Iroquoian village might have reached into the hundreds, perhaps more. These were not small hunter-gatherer bands. These were genuinely complex societies with agriculture, established trade networks, sophisticated material culture, and, based on everything the archaeological evidence suggests, rich symbolic and ceremonial traditions that have left traces in the ground wherever those villages once stood. The ground beneath Quebec City, and the ground along the St. Lawrence more broadly, contains layers of this complexity at multiple levels. There are the St. Lawrence Iroquoian occupations of the late pre-contact period. Beneath those, there are the occupations of their predecessors, the peoples of the woodland period, who were engaged in their own forms of social complexity going back 2,000 years. Beneath those are the traces of archaic period peoples whose relationship with the St. Lawrence Valley stretches back 8, 9, 10,000 years to a time when the landscape itself was still recovering from the retreat of the last great ice sheets. And then, beneath all of that, there are some things that don't fit neatly into any of those categories. Finds from the Quebec City region and from various points along the St. Lawrence that have generated controversy because they don't match the expected typological sequences, because they appear in contexts that suggest dates that seem too early, because they have characteristics that, in the eyes of some researchers, suggest connections or influences that the mainstream account of pre-Columbian North America does not easily accommodate. These are the finds that tend to disappear into institutional silence, not because there is a coordinated effort to suppress them, but because anomalies that don't fit the existing framework create administrative headaches. They require additional investigation that funding structures don't easily support. They generate arguments among specialists that institutions would rather avoid, and they raise questions about the accepted chronology that the people responsible for those institutions feel, often correctly in a narrow professional sense, unprepared to answer. So the anomalies get filed away, the artifacts get stored in boxes in museum basements, the site reports get written up in cautious language that notes the unexpected nature of the findings without drawing the conclusions those findings might logically support, and the streets get built over the places where the anomalies were found, sealing them permanently behind concrete and the weight of everything that comes after. Montreal is built on an island in the St. Lawrence. The island was formed by the intersection of the Ottawa River and the St. Lawrence, and it sits at the foot of a volcanic plug, the remains of an ancient eruption that produced the distinctive mountain that gives the city its name, Mont Royal, the mountain of the king. Except the mountain was there long before any king claimed it, and the island at its foot had been a significant human landscape for thousands of years before the French flag was planted anywhere near it. The evidence for continuous human occupation of the island of Montreal goes back at least 11,000 years. That is not a claim from fringe archaeology. That is the conclusion of mainstream archaeological investigations conducted over decades of work on the island and in its immediate surroundings. 11,000 years of human occupation puts the beginning of Montreal's human history in the period immediately following the retreat of the Laurentide ice sheet. The enormous continental glacier that covered most of Canada during the last glacial maximum. The people who were on the island of Montreal 11,000 years ago were Paleo-Indian peoples, the descendants of the first human populations to enter northeastern North America following the glacial retreat. They were living in a landscape that looked nothing like modern Montreal. The St. Lawrence was running differently. The forests were different. The climate was colder and drier. The animals available for hunting were different from the animals that would live in the region in later periods. But people were there, adapting, learning the landscape, beginning the long process of intimate knowledge that would characterize human occupation of the Montreal region for the next 11,000 years. Over that extraordinary span of time, the island of Montreal was occupied by peoples of the Plano tradition, the Shield Archaic, the Laurentian Archaic, the Meadowwood culture, the Middlesex culture, and eventually the Saint Lawrence Iroquoians, whom Cartier encountered at Hochelaga in 1534. Each of those occupations left traces in the soil of the island. Each of those traces has been, to varying degrees, disturbed, destroyed, or buried by the development that has covered the island over the past 4 centuries of European settlement. The raising of Montreal's streets happened in a particularly systematic way because of the city's geography. The island sits low relative to the river, and flooding was a constant problem in the early colonial period. The solution, implemented gradually through the 19th century and into the early 20th, was to raise the street grades in the lower-lying parts of the island, adding fill over what had been the original ground surface and creating a new, higher baseline for the urban landscape. The process buried not just natural ground, but the accumulated evidence of 11,000 years of human activity in those low-lying areas. Some of what was buried had already been disturbed. Montreal's rapid growth during the 19th century, when it was the largest city in Canada and one of the major industrial centres of North America, consumed archaeological sites at a pace that left virtually no opportunity for systematic investigation. The great infrastructure projects of that period, the harbour improvements, the railway construction, the expansion of the sewer system, the raising of streets in the waterfront districts, all of these moved enormous quantities of soil with very little attention paid to what that soil contained. But some of what was buried relatively intact, sealed under the new fill layers in a way that preserved it from further disturbance. In the areas where that has happened, where subsequent development has not penetrated deep enough to reach the original ground surface, there is potentially a remarkable archive of pre-contact Montreal waiting underground. An archive that, if it could be accessed and systematically investigated, would tell a story about 11,000 years of continuous human engagement with one of the most significant landscapes in northeastern North America. What that archive might contain is, in a very real sense, unknown. We have hints from the excavations that have managed to reach the early layers, from the salvage archaeology done ahead of major construction projects in recent decades, from the accidental finds that have turned up during utility work and foundation digging. Those hints suggest a picture of pre-contact Montreal that is considerably more complex and considerably more interesting than the standard narrative of simple hunting and gathering bands occupying the island in a loosely organized, technologically basic way. There are signs of substantial trade. Objects made from materials that could only have come from sources hundreds or thousands of kilometers away appear in pre-contact contexts on the island. There are signs of sustained contact with peoples from the south, from the Great Lakes, from the Ohio Valley. There are signs of ceremonial activity, of the kind of organized ritual behavior that, in other parts of North America, is associated with significant levels of social organization and symbolic sophistication. And there are, in the oral traditions of the peoples who have the longest connection to the island, references to things that happened there in a remote past, things that don't map neatly onto the archaeological sequences, as currently understood, things that point toward a history of the island that is stranger and older and more layered than anything the mainstream narrative has accommodated. To understand what might lie beneath the streets of Canadian cities, it helps to think about what was happening across the broader continent during the periods when those underground layers were being laid down. Because what was happening was not simple. It was not the story of isolated bands of hunter-gatherers wandering through an undifferentiated wilderness. It was, in important respects, the story of civilizations. That word, civilization, is one that gets applied very selectively in North American history. We apply it confidently to the Aztec Empire and to the Maya and to the Inca. We are a little more hesitant with it when we get to what is now the United States, but we will generally acknowledge Cahokia, the enormous city that flourished near the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers around 1,000 years ago, as representing something that at least approaches what we mean by civilization. And we are most reluctant of all to apply the word anywhere in what is now Canada, where the narrative of simple, uncomplicated pre-contact societies has been most thoroughly institutionalized. But the evidence from the ground tells a different story. It tells a story of sophisticated social organization, of long-distance exchange networks that functioned with remarkable efficiency across enormous distances, of substantial populations living in organized settlements, and of symbolic and ceremonial traditions of genuine complexity. It tells a story that archaeologists have been assembling, piece by piece, across the past several decades, and that is only now beginning to filter into popular consciousness. The Hopewell tradition is perhaps the best starting point for understanding the scale of what was happening in eastern North America during the period roughly 2,000 to 1,800 years ago. The Hopewell people, centered in the Ohio Valley, were building earthworks of staggering scale and geometric precision. The Newark earthworks in Ohio, for example, cover an area of more than 4 square miles, making them the largest earthwork complex in the world. The geometric precision of those earthworks, the way the circles and squares and octagonal enclosures are laid out in relationships that reflect sophisticated astronomical knowledge, is something that continues to astonish researchers who study them. But what the Hopewell people are most remarkable for, archaeologically speaking, is not their earthworks. It is their exchange network. The Hopewell exchange system moved materials across distances that challenge our assumptions about what pre-Columbian North Americans were capable of. Copper from Lake Superior turned up in Ohio Valley burial mounds. Obsidian from Yellowstone turned up in the same mounds. Marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico, shark teeth, silver from Ontario. The network was not limited to raw materials. Objects already fashioned, crafted items of considerable skill and artistry, also moved through the network. The distances those objects traveled suggest contacts, relationships, and organized systems of exchange that extended across essentially the entire eastern half of the continent. And those systems reached into what is now Canada. The Ontario portion of the Hopewell network is documented in the archaeological record of the southern Great Lakes region. Sites in what are now southern Ontario and Quebec show the characteristic Hopewell-influenced material culture, the distinctive pottery, the burial practices, the presence of traded exotic materials, that identifies participation in the broader Hopewell exchange sphere. The people living in what is now Ontario 2,000 years ago were not isolated. They were connected to one of the largest and most sophisticated social networks in pre-Columbian North America. What came before the Hopewell tradition in Canada, and what came after it, is less well understood. The Archaic period, spanning roughly 10,000 to 3,000 years ago, is a vast stretch of time across which the peoples of northeastern North America developed in ways that have left substantial traces in the archaeological record, but that have been studied with nothing like the intensity applied to the pause. More recent and more dramatic expressions of pre-Columbian social complexity. The Laurentian Archaic, which centered on the St. Lawrence Valley and the Great Lakes region, was a tradition of considerable sophistication. The Maritime Archaic, which developed along the Atlantic coast and into Labrador, was among the most remarkable cultural traditions in all of pre-Columbian North America. The Maritime Archaic Red Paint people, as they are sometimes called in the older literature, were a culture that developed along the coasts and rivers of Atlantic Canada and the northeastern United States, beginning roughly 7,000 years ago and persisting in some form until perhaps 3,000 years ago. They are called the Red Paint people because of their distinctive burial practice, coating the bodies and grave goods of their dead in red ochre, in quantities that have made their burial sites unmistakable when encountered by archaeologists. And the burial sites, when investigated, have produced evidence of a way of life that is anything but simple or primitive. The Maritime Archaic peoples were deep-water mariners. They hunted swordfish and large whales in open ocean conditions that would have required sophisticated watercraft and highly developed seafaring knowledge. Their tools, made primarily from a distinctive green slate called Rama chert from sources in northern Labrador, were found at sites hundreds of kilometers from those sources, demonstrating a capacity for organized long-distance movement and trade. Their burial practices included the deliberate placement of grave goods, including objects from distant sources, that indicates a complex symbolic and ceremonial tradition. These were people with a highly developed relationship with the sea, people who understood ocean currents, who read the migrations of marine animals, who built boats capable of sustained open ocean travel, people whose knowledge of the Atlantic was, in some respects, more sophisticated than anything that would appear in the same waters for thousands of years. And then, around 3,000 years ago, the Maritime Archaic disappears from the archaeological record of Atlantic Canada. Not gradually, relatively abruptly, replaced, in the southern portions of their range, by peoples with different material culture and different subsistence strategies. The causes of that disappearance are uncertain. Climate change plays a role in most of the explanations offered. Conflict with incoming populations is another factor that has been considered. The possibility of epidemic disease affecting a population with limited experience of the pathogens carried by newly arrived groups from the south is a hypothesis that some researchers have entertained. Whatever happened to the Maritime Archaic, their disappearance left a significant gap in the human history of Atlantic Canada, a gap that the peoples who followed them, including the ancestors of the Mi'kmaq and other Algonquian-speaking nations of the Atlantic region, would spend millennia filling with their own deep and sophisticated knowledge of the landscape. But the Maritime Archaic themselves, the people who had been building their culture along those coasts for 4,000 years, left their traces in the ground. And some of those traces, buried under the development of towns and cities along the Atlantic coast, are among the most remarkable and least understood chapters of the pre-Columbian Canadian story. Let's go west now, far west, to the coast where the mountains come down to the sea in a landscape so dramatically beautiful and so ecologically rich that it almost seems designed by something that wanted to show off. The Pacific Northwest coast of British Columbia is one of the most remarkable environments on Earth, and it was, for thousands of years before European contact, the site of one of the most sophisticated non-agricultural civilizations in human history. The coastal peoples of British Columbia, the ancestors of the modern nations we know as the Haida, the Tlingit, the Tsimshian, the Gitxsan, the Wet'suwet'en, the Heiltsuk, the Nu-Chah-Nulth, the Coast Salish, and many others, had developed a way of life based on the extraordinary abundance of the Pacific coast ecosystem that supported population densities, levels of social complexity, and elaborations of material and symbolic culture that were, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. The totem poles, the big houses, the elaborate ceremonial regalia, the sophisticated woodworking, the complex systems of hereditary rank and ceremonial obligation, the oral traditions of extraordinary richness and depth, all of these are well known. What is less well understood is how deep in time those traditions go, and what the landscape of British Columbia's coast looked like before the period when the famous material culture of the northwest coast became visible in the archaeological record. The sea levels of the Pacific coast were significantly different in the early post-glacial period. During the last glacial maximum, when enormous amounts of water were locked up in the continental ice sheets, sea levels globally were much lower than they are today, in some places by more than 100 meters. As those ice sheets melted, sea levels rose, gradually flooding coastal landscapes that had previously been dry land. Along the coast of British Columbia, this process means that the most likely locations of early human settlement, the places where people would have lived in the immediate post-glacial period when they first arrived or remained on the coast, are now underwater. This is not a minor inconvenience for archaeologists. It is a fundamental challenge to understanding the earliest history of human occupation on the British Columbia coast. The sites are there, they have to be. The coast has been inhabited for at least 14,000 years, and probably longer. But the sites from the earliest period are sitting on the continental shelf, under varying depths of ocean water, in conditions that make systematic archaeological investigation extremely difficult. What has been recovered from those submerged contexts, where investigation has been possible, is genuinely remarkable. At sites along the central coast of British Columbia, underwater archaeological work has produced evidence of human occupation going back to periods well before the commonly cited dates for the peopling of the Americas. Stone tools, hearth features, faunal remains, all sitting on surfaces that were dry land during the period when sea levels were lower, and that have been underwater for varying periods depending on when sea level rise flooded them. The significance of this for understanding the history of British Columbia, and more broadly for understanding the peopling of the Americas, is difficult to overstate. If people were on the British Columbia coast 14,000 years ago or earlier, and the evidence suggests they were, then the story of how humans arrived in the Americas and how they spread through the continent needs significant revision. The Kelp Highway hypothesis, which proposes that early Americans moved rapidly down the Pacific coast, following the productive marine ecosystem of the North Pacific, rather than coming through an inland corridor between ice sheets, is now supported by a substantial and growing body of evidence. What that means for British Columbia specifically is that the human history of that coast is very much older than any of the urban development that has occurred there could possibly accommodate in its understanding of the landscape. Vancouver, built at the mouth of the Fraser River, in a location that the Coast Salish peoples had been using as a significant gathering and resource extraction site for thousands of years, was constructed on top of a human landscape of extraordinary antiquity. The Fraser River Delta, where the river deposits its sediment load into the Strait of Georgia, was a tremendously productive landscape in the pre-contact period. The great salmon runs that the river supports were, for thousands of years, the economic foundation of Coast Salish life in the Vancouver region. The villages that the Coast Salish established at the mouths of the Fraser's distributaries, at the confluence of tributary streams, along the shores of the delta's various channels, were substantial settlements, occupied on a seasonal or semi-permanent basis, that left significant deposits of cultural material in the soil. When Vancouver's urban development began in the 1860s and accelerated dramatically after the arrival of the Transcontinental Railway in 1886, those deposits were disturbed and destroyed at a pace that left almost no opportunity for systematic documentation. The development moved too fast. The institutional appetite for archaeological investigation was too limited. The cultural framework in which the developers operated simply did not accommodate the idea that what was in the ground under the nascent city might be worth preserving or even properly recording, and then the streets went in. The grading and filling that accompanied urban development in Vancouver, particularly in the low-lying delta areas and along the waterfront, buried what remained of the pre-contact landscape under a new urban surface. Much of what was there before, the shell middens that are among the most reliable indicators of sustained coastal occupation, the post-molds and hearth features of former structures, the deposits of worked bone and stone that represent the material residue of Coast Salish life across millennia, is now sealed beneath the city. What is particularly striking about the Coast Salish landscape around what is now Vancouver is the density of occupation evidence that survives in the areas that escape development. The middens on the shores of Burrard Inlet, the occupation sites along the arms of the Fraser Delta, the significant archaeological deposits at locations like Musqueam, where a village has been continuously occupied for several thousand years. All of these give some indication of what was once spread across the landscape that is now covered by the city. The city of Vancouver, in other words, is sitting on a pre-contact landscape of extraordinary richness and antiquity, a landscape that represents thousands of years of sophisticated human adaptation to one of the most productive coastal environments in the world. And most of that landscape is buried. Most of it is inaccessible. Most of it has been destroyed. But not all of it. There are pockets, there are layers, there are preserved contexts that have survived by accident or by oversight. And in those places, the ground still holds its stories. Stories that, if we were willing to do the work of listening to them, would transform our understanding of what British Columbia was before it became British Columbia. The question of pre-Columbian contact, of peoples from outside North America reaching the continent before Columbus's 1492 voyage, is one of the most contested areas in the study of the ancient Americas. Official academic culture has, for most of the past century, been deeply resistant to pre-Columbian contact claims. The reasons for that resistance are partly legitimate, rooted in the methodological caution that should govern claims about extraordinary events, and partly less legitimate, rooted in institutional inertia, professional risk aversion, and in some cases, a cultural politics that has complicated the discussion in ways that are not always helpful. The legitimate resistance is worth acknowledging. The history of pre-Columbian contact claims is littered with bad archaeology, wishful thinking, nationalist mythology, and outright fraud. The story of the Kensington runestone, supposedly a medieval Norse inscription found in Minnesota in 1898, is a cautionary tale about how easily physical objects can be fabricated, and how powerful the desire to find confirmation of preconceived narratives can be. Similar cautionary tales could be told about various claimed inscriptions, artifacts, and structures that have been offered over the years as evidence of pre-Columbian contact from the Old World. Skepticism, in this field, is not only appropriate but necessary. But there is a difference between healthy skepticism and reflexive dismissal. And the evidence for at least some forms of pre-Columbian contact with North America is, at this point, sufficiently strong that reflexive dismissal is no longer an intellectually defensible position. The Norse presence in North America is the clearest case. Lansall Meadows, the Norse site at the northern tip of Newfoundland, was definitively confirmed as a genuine Norse settlement through a combination of artifact analysis, radiocarbon dating, and eventually, dendrochronological dating of the wood used in its structures. The site dates to approximately 1000 CE, half a millennium before Columbus, and it represents the remains of a Norse base camp of the kind described in the Icelandic sagas' accounts of Vinland. This is not contested, it is established fact. What is considerably more contested is the extent of the Norse presence in North America beyond Lansall Meadows. The sagas describe multiple voyages to Vinland and neighbouring regions over a period of perhaps a decade or more. They describe settlements, conflicts with indigenous peoples, whom the Norse called Skraelings, trade, and eventually abandonment of the North American ventures in the face of hostility from those indigenous peoples. The question of where exactly these various Vinland voyages went, how far south and west they penetrated, has never been definitively answered. Some researchers have argued that the Norse reached Nova Scotia, that they travelled up the St. Lawrence, that they made contact with peoples far beyond the immediate area of Lansall Meadows. The archaeological evidence for these more extensive Norse penetrations of North America is much thinner than the evidence for Lansall Meadows itself, but it is not non-existent. There are finds from various points along the Atlantic coast and even further inland that have been tentatively or controversially associated with Norse presence. Most of these claims are disputed, but some of them are intriguing enough that they cannot simply be dismissed. The point, for the purposes of understanding what might lie beneath the streets of Canadian cities, is that the period of Norse contact with North America, roughly 1000 to 1025 CE, was a moment when people from outside the continent were physically present in what is now Canada. They brought things with them. They left things behind. They had interactions with indigenous peoples that left traces in the material record and, almost certainly, in oral traditions. And those traces are buried somewhere in the landscape of Atlantic Canada, waiting to be found, if they have not already been destroyed by the development that has swept across that landscape over the past 4 centuries. Beyond the Norse, the question of other pre-Columbian contacts with North America gets considerably more speculative and considerably more contentious. The claims for Phoenician, Egyptian, Chinese, Welsh, Irish, and various other visitors to pre-Columbian North America are, most of them, based on evidence that does not survive careful scrutiny. The inscriptions are misidentified natural markings or modern fakes. The artifacts are out of context and easily explained as post-Columbian imports. The structural similarities between Old World and New World cultural elements that contact theorists love to cite are, in most cases, the result of independent parallel development rather than actual contact. But there is one body of pre-Columbian contact evidence that occupies a middle ground between the firmly established Norse case and the speculative fringe, and that has particular relevance to the Canadian context. That is the evidence for trans-Pacific contact between coastal Asia and the Pacific coast of North America. The Kuroshio Current, the great ocean current that flows northeast from the Philippines and Taiwan along the Japanese coast and then swings east across the North Pacific toward the coast of North America, is a natural pathway that could have, and in the opinion of a growing number of researchers almost certainly did, carry people from coastal Asia to the Pacific coast of North America long before European contact. Boats that became disabled in the Kuroshio Current would be carried involuntarily to the North American coast. The question of whether anyone made the crossing intentionally is more open, but the involuntary drift voyage hypothesis requires only that there were functional watercraft in the North Pacific, which has been true for tens of thousands of years. The genetic evidence is beginning to provide some support for at least occasional trans-Pacific contact. Certain genetic markers found in some indigenous populations of South America have been interpreted by some researchers as indicating contact with Polynesian populations in the pre-Columbian period. The sweet potato, a crop with clear South American origins, was present in Polynesia before European contact, which requires some mechanism of trans-Pacific transfer. The chicken, whose presence in pre-Columbian Chile has been argued on the basis of archaeological finds and genetic analysis, is another potential indicator. These South American cases are not directly relevant to Canada, but they establish a context in which trans-Pacific contact of some kind becomes a more reasonable proposition for the North American continent as a whole. And if the British Columbia coast, with its position at the eastern end of the Kuroshio Current, was the landfall point for any trans-Pacific contacts, then the archaeological signature of those contacts would presumably be found somewhere in the buried landscapes beneath Vancouver and the other coastal cities of British Columbia. What that signature would look like, how it would be distinguished from indigenous material culture with which it would inevitably be mixed, what traces of trans-Pacific contact might actually survive in the archaeological record of the British Columbia coast. These are questions that researchers have been asking for decades without definitive answers. But they are not questions that can be dismissed simply because the answers are hard to find. The oral traditions of the Indigenous peoples of Canada contain, within them, a vast amount of information about the deep past of the continent, information that has been systematically undervalued by the academic and institutional frameworks through which North American history has been written and taught. The reasons for that undervaluation are multiple and intertwined, involving colonialism, racism, the prestige hierarchy of academic disciplines, and the fundamental epistemological tension between oral and written traditions as sources of historical knowledge. But the tide is turning. Slowly but meaningfully, researchers are beginning to take indigenous oral traditions seriously as historical sources, not as literal transcriptions of specific events, but as repositories of information about the past that have been transmitted with remarkable accuracy over very long periods of time. The story of the Australian Aboriginal oral traditions and their relationship to landscape features provides an instructive parallel. Several Aboriginal oral traditions from Australia describe geological events, including the flooding of coastal areas by rising sea levels, that have been dated by geologists to periods 10,000 years ago or more. The oral traditions that describe these events have been transmitted across hundreds of generations with enough accuracy to allow researchers to identify the specific geological events they describe. This is not mythology in the dismissive sense. This is something that looks, in its accuracy and its transmission fidelity, remarkably like historical record. Similar considerations apply to the oral traditions of the Indigenous peoples of Canada, the stories that have been passed down through the generations, stories about the landscape, about events that happened in the remote past, about the relationships between different peoples and between people and the land, contain information that deserves to be taken seriously as historical evidence, not uncritically, not as literal truth in every detail, but seriously as the primary historical record of a people who have been continuously present on this land for a very long time. The Mi'kmaq of Atlantic Canada, the Algonquin and Anishinaabe of the Great Lakes region, the Haudenosaunee of the Street, Lawrence Valley, the Cree and Ojibwe of the Boreal Forest, the peoples of the prairies, the Dene of the Northwest, the coastal peoples of British Columbia, all of these nations maintain oral traditions that contain layers of reference to the past that extend back far beyond the reach of written historical records. Some of those layers describe events that correspond to known archaeological sequences. Some of them describe things that have not yet been identified in the archaeological record, and some of them describe things that, if taken seriously, would require us to significantly revise our understanding of the deep history of the continent. The traditions of the Anishinaabe, for example, contain references to a time when the landscape was very different from its current form, when the lakes and rivers ran differently, when certain features of the land that now exist were not yet present. Some researchers have interpreted these traditions as containing memories of the immediate post-glacial period, when the Great Lakes were still forming and the drainage patterns of the region were being established. If that interpretation is correct, then the Anishinaabe oral tradition contains information about events that happened more than 10,000 years ago, transmitted across 400 generations with enough coherence to remain identifiable. The oral traditions of the coastal peoples of British Columbia contain similarly deep layers. The Haida and the Tsimshian and the other nations of the northern coast have stories about times when the sea was lower, when there was land where there is now ocean, when the coastal landscape had a configuration quite different from its present form. These stories, taken at face value, describe the geography of the post-glacial period before sea level rise had reached its modern level, that is, before approximately 8 to 10,000 years ago. If they are genuinely that old, if they are preserving memories of a landscape that has not existed for 8 to 10,000 years, they represent one of the most remarkable examples of long-term oral transmission in the human record. The significance of this for understanding what lies beneath the streets of Canadian cities is partly direct and partly indirect. Directly, the oral traditions sometimes provide specific information about places, about features of the landscape that have been buried or built over, that could, if followed up archaeologically, lead to the discovery of cultural material in places where it would not otherwise be looked for. Indirectly, the oral traditions provide a framework for understanding the deep past of these landscapes that is, in important respects, more sophisticated than the framework provided by the conventional historical and archaeological narrative. The conventional narrative says that the land now called Canada was sparsely populated in the pre-contact period by technologically simple peoples living in small, mobile bands with limited social complexity. The oral traditions say something considerably different. They describe a past in which the land was more populated, in which social organization was more complex, in which the relationships between different peoples and between people and the land were richer and more intricate than the conventional narrative accommodates. Both of those accounts, the conventional narrative and the oral traditions, are incomplete. The conventional narrative is limited by the gaps in the archaeological record and by the institutional frameworks through which that record has been interpreted. The oral traditions are limited by the inevitable transformations that occur over the thousands of years of transmission through which they have passed. But taken together, cross-referenced against each other, and against the physical evidence from the ground, they begin to sketch the outlines of a history that is considerably more interesting than either account alone would suggest. The prairie provinces of Canada, the great grassland interior that stretches from the Shield in the east to the Rockies in the west, are not a landscape that most people associate with archaeological mystery. The image most commonly attached to the pre-contact prairie is of nomadic bison hunters, peoples following the great herds across the open grassland in a pattern of life that, while admirable in its own right and genuinely sophisticated in its understanding of the prairie ecosystem, is often framed as simpler and less complex than the traditions of the eastern woodland peoples or the coastal cultures of the Pacific. That framing is wrong. The people of the Canadian prairies developed, over thousands of years of occupation, a relationship with the grassland ecosystem that was anything but simple, and a social and material complexity that has been substantially underestimated by the conventional accounts. The most dramatic evidence of that complexity is the buffalo jump. These are sites where bison were driven over cliffs in organized hunts that required the cooperation of large numbers of people working in carefully coordinated roles across a broad landscape. The head-smashed-in buffalo jump in southern Alberta, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, was used for this purpose for approximately 6,000 years. 6,000 years of organized communal bison hunting at a single site. Think about what that means in terms of social organization. The drive of a bison herd over a cliff requires a minimum of dozens of people, probably more, working in coordinated roles that are defined well in advance and executed with precision. Someone has to understand the behavior of the herd well enough to know which way it will move under pressure. Someone has to organize the drivers who will push the herd in the desired direction. Someone has to position people at the flanks to prevent the herd from breaking around the drive lines. Someone has to manage the killing below the cliff and the butchering and processing that follows. And all of this has to happen repeatedly, reliably, year after year, generation after generation, at the same site. That level of organized cooperation does not emerge spontaneously. It requires social structures, probably hereditary leadership, or at minimum hereditary expertise, that can maintain the knowledge and the organization across generations. It requires communication systems capable of coordinating people over a significant landscape area. It requires a technology of driving lanes, sometimes made of stone cairns called drive lanes or buffalo runners, that had to be constructed, maintained, and understood by everyone involved in the drive. The stone drive lanes at Head Smashed In extend for kilometers across the prairie above the cliff. They were built by human hands, stone by stone, to guide the movement of the herd. Their construction represents an investment of labor that, multiplied across the 6,000 years of the site's use, is almost incalculable. These are not the remnants of simple, barely organized hunter-gatherer activity. They are the permanent infrastructure of a complex, organized society that understood its landscape in extraordinary depth and managed it with considerable sophistication. And Head Smashed In is not unique. There are dozens of buffalo jump sites across the Canadian prairies, each representing a similar investment of labor and organization, each representing a similar depth of knowledge and social complexity. The buffalo jump tradition, considered as a whole, represents one of the most remarkable examples of sustained human landscape management in the pre-contact Americas. Beneath the surface of that same landscape, there are other traces of the deep human history of the prairies. The medicine wheels, the great stone circle constructions found across the prairie provinces and extending into the northern United States, are among the most mysterious and least understood features of pre-contact Canada. These structures, some of them with spokes radiating from a central cairn across diameters of dozens of meters, have been interpreted variously as ceremonial sites, astronomical observatories, territorial markers, and memorials. Their ages range from a few hundred years to several thousand, and their builders, in most cases, are not definitively identified. The Majorville Medicine Wheel in southern Alberta is one of the oldest and most significant. At its core is a cairn of stones that has been accumulating material for approximately 5,000 years, making it one of the oldest continually used ceremonial sites in North America. The wheel itself, the arrangement of stone spokes radiating from the central cairn, is more recent, but the continuity of use at the site across 5 millennia suggests that Majorville occupied a place in the ceremonial geography of the prairies that was recognized and respected across many generations of peoples who may not have shared language or material culture, but who recognized the significance of this particular place in the landscape. The astronomy at some of the medicine wheels is striking enough to deserve attention. The Bighorn Medicine Wheel in Wyoming, which is one of the best studied examples, has cairns arranged around its circumference at positions that correspond to the rising points of significant stars on the horizon at the summer solstice. Similar astronomical alignments have been proposed for several of the Canadian medicine wheels, though the evidence is less systematically studied. If those alignments are intentional, and the Bighorn example is strong enough to suggest they may be, then the builders of the medicine wheels were engaged in a tradition of astronomical observation and encoding of astronomical knowledge in stone that reflects a level of intellectual sophistication that tends to get overlooked in the standard accounts of prairie pre-contact culture. What is buried beneath the prairies, both literally and metaphorically, is the record of a human relationship with that landscape stretching back 12,000 years or more. The first peoples on the post-glacial prairie arrived into an environment in transition, a landscape where the megafauna of the Pleistocene, the mammoths and mastodons and ground sloths, were in the process of going extinct, where the great grassland ecosystem was still taking its definitive post-glacial form. Those first peoples adapted to that landscape and began the long process of learning it, managing it, shaping their social and ceremonial lives around it, that would continue for thousands of years. The cities and towns of the prairie provinces, Edmonton and Calgary and Saskatoon and Regina and Winnipeg, were built on top of that landscape, built on the bones of a human history that the settlers who established those cities had no framework for understanding and no interest in preserving. The ground beneath the prairie cities holds the evidence of 12,000 years of human engagement with one of the most dramatic ecosystems on the continent. Most of it is inaccessible, buried under concrete and fill, and the accumulated weight of a century and a half of urban development. But the stones of the medicine wheels still stand. The drive lanes that had smashed in are still visible on the prairie above the cliff. The oral traditions of the Plains nations still carry, within them, the memories of a past that extends far beyond the reach of any written record. The land has not entirely forgotten what was done on it, and in it, and for it, across those 12,000 years. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over archaeological sites at night. Those of us who have spent time on excavations, who have sat at the edge of an open trench in the last light of the day watching the soil profiles of another era emerge from shadow, know that silence, it is not the absence of sound. It is something more like the presence of time, the sense that the ground itself is listening, that it knows something you do not, that it has been patient in a way you cannot quite understand. That silence is part of what this story is about. It is about the patience of the earth, the way it holds things, the way it preserves them against the urgency and the indifference of the surface above. The streets of Canadian cities are loud. They are full of traffic and commerce, and the continuous hum of urban machinery. But beneath them, in the soil and clay and gravel that underlies the concrete and asphalt, there is a different kind of time at work. A time measured in centuries and millennia rather than minutes and hours. A time in which the things deposited in the ground by the people who lived on this land before the cities came are still there, still waiting, still holding their information. The silence of that underground time is interrupted occasionally by the activity of the surface above, by the machinery of construction that cuts through the accumulated layers of the past to make room for new infrastructure, by the utilities that thread through the soil, carrying water and electricity and data, by the foundations of new buildings that punch down through the urban fill into the substrate below. Each of those intrusions is a moment when the silence breaks, when the past becomes briefly visible, when there is an opportunity to see what the ground contains. Most of those opportunities are missed. The construction timelines do not accommodate careful examination of what the machinery is disturbing. The regulatory frameworks that exist to protect archaeological sites are imperfect and unevenly enforced. The culture of urban development, with its emphasis on speed and efficiency and the rapid conversion of ground into revenue-generating surface, does not naturally create space for the slow, careful attention that archaeological investigation requires. But some of those opportunities are seized. Some of the moments when the past becomes briefly visible are captured by researchers who happen to be there, or who are called in when a construction crew turns up something obviously remarkable, or who have managed to negotiate the regulatory process successfully enough to conduct a salvage excavation ahead of development. And what those researchers find, in the moments when they are able to look, continues to expand and complicate our understanding of what was here before. In Toronto, a salvage excavation conducted in the 1990s ahead of a condominium development in the Humber River Valley turned up evidence of sustained occupation going back approximately 8,000 years. The material included stone tools, the remains of hearths, and faunal material, indicating the hunting of species that have not been present in the Toronto region for several thousand years. The site was documented, the most significant materials were collected, and then it was destroyed to make way for the new building. The report from that excavation sits in a government archive in Toronto, available to researchers who know to look for it, largely unknown to everyone else. In Montreal, the construction of the underground metro system in the 1960s cut through some of the oldest layers of pre-contact occupation on the island. The speed of metro construction and the relative immaturity of Quebec's archaeological protection framework at the time meant that most of what was disturbed went undocumented. Some material was salvaged by archaeologists working at the edges of the construction process, but it represented a tiny fraction of what was destroyed. In Vancouver, the development of the False Creek area in the 1980s and 1990s, which converted the industrial waterfront south of downtown into a residential and commercial district, disturbed numerous sites that had been identified in preliminary surveys as containing significant pre-contact cultural material. The salvage archaeology conducted ahead of development recovered substantial quantities of material, but was unable to investigate all of the affected sites in adequate depth. In Halifax, Victoria, St. John, Charlottetown, Fredericton, in every city where the physical fabric of the urban landscape has been constructed and reconstructed over the past 3 or 4 centuries, similar stories could be told. The ground contains more than the development process has given it credit for. The history buried beneath the streets is deeper and more complex than the official narratives acknowledge. The question is what to do with that understanding, not in a political sense, not in a sense that assigns blame for what has been lost, but in the more fundamental sense of how we understand the place we are in, how we relate to the land we are living on, how we incorporate the deep history of the landscape into our sense of where we are and who we are. There is a concept that geographers and archaeologists sometimes use to describe the relationship between human communities and the landscapes they inhabit over very long periods of time. They call it taskscape. The idea is that landscapes are not simply passive backdrops against which human activity takes place. They are active environments that are shaped by the activity they support, that carry within them the physical traces of generations of human engagement, and that in turn shape the activity of the communities that inhabit them through the affordances and constraints they present. The landscapes of Canada, all of them, not just the dramatic wilderness landscapes that dominate the tourist brochures, but the urban landscapes of the cities where most Canadians now live, are taskscapes in this sense. They are environments that have been shaped by thousands of years of human engagement. They carry within them the physical traces of that engagement, and they continue to shape, in ways both obvious and subtle, the activity of the communities that inhabit them. The underground layers of Canadian cities are part of that taskscape. They are not inert storage, sealed containers of the past, with no relationship to the present above. They are, in a profound sense, the foundation of the present. The soil conditions, the drainage patterns, the topographical features that the surface development was built on top of, all of these are shaped by what happened in those layers across thousands of years of prior occupation. The landscape that the settlers encountered when they began building their cities was not a blank slate. It was a deeply worked landscape, modified by millennia of human activity, carrying the marks of every generation that had inhabited it. The ravines of Toronto are a good example. These deeply incised valleys, carved by post-glacial meltwater and maintained by the drainage systems of the rivers that run through them, are among the most significant landscape features of the Toronto region. They have been recognized, in recent decades, as important ecological corridors and green spaces that provide ecosystem services and recreational opportunities to the urban population. But they were also, for thousands of years before Toronto existed, the most productive and most intensively used parts of the landscape. They provided access to fresh water. They provided shelter from wind and the distinctive weather conditions of the lake shore. They provided rich soil for plant gathering. They channeled the movement of game animals. And they accumulated, in their valley bottoms and on their sheltered slopes, the deepest and most stratified deposits of pre-contact occupation in the Toronto region. The ravines are now protected, at least in part, from the development that has covered the rest of the landscape. And in those protected areas, the soil still holds what it has held for thousands of years. Researchers who have had the opportunity to investigate ravine sites in the Toronto region have found evidence of occupation going back to the earliest post-glacial period, evidence of sustained use across millennia, evidence of a depth and continuity of human engagement with these specific landscape features that should fundamentally change our understanding of what the Toronto landscape was before the city covered it. But most people who walk the ravine trails of Toronto have no idea they are walking through what is, in effect, one of the longest continuously inhabited places in northeastern North America. The information is not hidden. It is in the academic literature, in the site reports, in the collections of the ROM and the Toronto Reference Library. But it is not integrated into the way the city understands itself, the way it tells its story, the way it relates to the landscape it occupies. That disconnection between the deep history of the landscape and the self-understanding of the city is not unique to Toronto. It is characteristic of every major Canadian city, and it represents a significant impoverishment of the way those cities understand themselves and the land they occupy. The impoverishment is not inevitable. There are places where the reconnection between the urban present and the deep past of the landscape has been achieved, at least in part, and where the results have been, for the communities involved, genuinely transformative. The waterfront area of Victoria, British Columbia, contains one of the most significant pre-contact sites in the region, the Songhees Point site, which was occupied for approximately 3,000 years before the establishment of Fort Victoria in 1843. The Songhees people, ancestors of the Songhees Nation, lived at this site for those 3,000 years, exploiting the rich marine resources of the inner harbour and the surrounding landscape. When the fort was established, the Songhees were moved across the harbour, and the original village site was progressively developed as part of the growing colonial town. But the memory of the site and the relationship of the Songhees Nation to it never disappeared. And in recent decades, as the cultural and legal frameworks governing Indigenous heritage in Canada have evolved, the Songhees Nation has been able to participate in the documentation and interpretation of their ancestral site in ways that were not previously possible. Archaeological investigations conducted with Songhees participation have produced evidence of the 3,000-year occupation in significant detail. The results have been incorporated into interpretive materials for the general public. The Songhees Nation's relationship to the landscape of Victoria's inner harbour is now part of the way the city tells its story. That kind of reconnection is possible. It has happened, in various forms, in other places as well. The Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations' involvement in the planning and development of the Vancouver area has increased substantially in recent decades, bringing Indigenous perspectives on the deep history of the landscape into conversations about land use, development, and the preservation of cultural heritage that were previously conducted entirely without that perspective. The growing recognition of Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe connections to the landscape of the Toronto region is changing, at least partially, the way the city engages with its pre-contact history. But these changes, while real and significant, remain partial. The depth of the reconnection that would be required to truly integrate the deep history of the Canadian landscape into the self-understanding of Canadian cities is considerable. It would require not just the inclusion of Indigenous voices in specific conversations about specific sites, but a fundamental reorientation of the way the cities understand themselves in relation to the land they occupy. It would require acknowledging that the cities are not built on empty land, but on landscapes with their own histories stretching back not hundreds but thousands of years, histories that have left physical traces in the ground beneath the urban surface, and cultural traces in the oral traditions and living cultures of the peoples who have the deepest connection to those landscapes. It would require, in other words, a different kind of humility about what we know and what we do not know about the places we call home. A humility that is, in the end, simply the recognition of how much history lies beneath our feet. The river valleys of Ontario deserve particular attention because they are among the most archaeologically rich landscapes in Canada and because they have been, in many cases, among the most intensively developed. The Thames River Valley, the Grand River Valley, the Credit River Valley, the Niagara Escarpment Corridor, all of these are landscapes that were intensively occupied in the pre-contact period and that have been substantially transformed by subsequent development. The Grand River Valley is particularly significant. The Grand drains a substantial portion of southwestern Ontario, running from its headwaters near Dundalk southwestward to its mouth at Lake Erie near Port Maitland. Along its length, the valley contains some of the most significant evidence of pre-contact occupation in Ontario, including the remains of several of the largest and most complex settlements, known from the late woodland period in the northeastern Great Lakes region. The Iroquoian peoples, who occupied the Grand River Valley in the period roughly between 900 and 1650 CE, were village agriculturalists of considerable sophistication. They grew corn, beans, and squash in large fields around their villages. Their villages were substantial, enclosed by multiple rows of palisade, and containing populations that in some cases reached into the hundreds or even the low thousands. The social organization of these communities, the political relationships between them, the ceremonial and symbolic traditions that they maintained, all of these represent a level of complexity that the conventional narrative of Ontario pre-contact history often fails to convey. The evidence from these villages, where they have been investigated archaeologically, is remarkable. The remains of longhouses, the great communal dwellings that are characteristic of Iroquoian settlement, can extend for dozens of meters. The faunal remains from village middens show a diverse diet that combined hunting, fishing, gathering, and cultivation in a way that was both nutritionally sophisticated and environmentally balanced. The artifact assemblages from these sites include not just the everyday tools of domestic life, but objects that reflect participation in long-distance trade networks, ceremonial objects of considerable artistry, and in some cases items whose function and significance remain unclear. The Grand River Valley settlements of the late woodland period were not isolated communities. They were part of a regional network of interaction that extended across all of southern Ontario and into adjacent areas of New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Michigan. The peoples who inhabited those communities were connected to each other and to more distant groups through systems of political alliance, ceremonial exchange, and kinship that made the pre-contact social landscape of the northeastern Great Lakes one of the most complex in temperate North America. And then, in the early decades of the 17th century, that landscape was transformed. The disruptions of the early contact period, involving the introduction of European trade goods, epidemic disease, the disruption of traditional patterns of alliance and competition, and eventually the violence of the Beaver Wars, reshaped the human geography of the Great Lakes region in ways whose full magnitude is only now beginning to be appreciated. The large Iroquoian villages of southern Ontario were abandoned. The populations that had inhabited them dispersed, some joining with the Haudenosaunee to the south, some moving north, some disappearing into the historical record as separate entities. The landscape they left behind was not empty. It was deeply marked by their presence, by centuries of land use, by the physical remains of their villages, their fields, their ceremonial sites. But within a generation or two of the major European settlement of southern Ontario, those marks were being covered over. The Loyalist settlers, who came to the Grand River Valley after the American Revolution, found a landscape that they interpreted as wilderness, as empty land available for their use, because the communities that had shaped it were no longer visible in the way that European communities would have been visible. The fields had reverted to forest, the villages were mounds of earth. The palisades had rotted away, but the evidence was there, in the soil. And as the settlers began to farm and to build and to drain the wetlands and to channel the rivers and to do all the other things that agricultural settlers do to a landscape, they turned it up: artifacts, burials, post-molds, layers of ash and bone, the physical residue of the centuries of Iroquoian occupation that had preceded them. Some of what they found was kept, some of it made its way into early collections, into the hands of the amateur antiquarians of the 19th century, who were beginning to take an interest in the pre-contact past of the land around them. Some of it ended up in the collections of organizations like the Ontario Archaeological Society, which was founded in 1950 and which has been working ever since to document and protect the archaeological heritage of Ontario. But most of it was ploughed under, carted away, built over, incorporated into the fabric of the new landscape without any understanding of what it was. The Grand River Valley today is a productive agricultural and urban landscape that shows few outward signs of the complex pre-contact history beneath its surface. The city of Brantford, named for the Mohawk leader Joseph Brant, who settled the Six Nations of the Grand River on their Grand River lands after the American Revolution, sits in a landscape that was, for centuries before that settlement, one of the most densely occupied and most culturally sophisticated landscapes in Ontario. What is underground there, in the soil of the Grand River Valley and the surrounding uplands, is a record of that history, imperfect, incomplete, damaged by centuries of agricultural and urban development, but present, waiting, in the patient way that the earth always waits, for attention and care and the willingness to take seriously what it has to say. The question of why this history has been so consistently undervalued, why the buried past of Canada's cities has been so consistently overlooked, has answers that operate at multiple levels. At the most basic level, the answer is practical. Urban development moves fast, and archaeological investigation moves slowly. The economics of real estate development do not naturally accommodate the time and cost requirements of adequate archaeological survey and excavation. The regulatory frameworks that exist to protect archaeological heritage are inconsistent, underfunded, and in many jurisdictions not well enforced. At a deeper level, the answer is cultural. The society that built the cities of Canada was one that had a powerful narrative of its own making, a narrative in which the land was essentially empty before the colonists arrived, in which whatever had existed before was primitive and simple, and therefore not worthy of the same consideration as the impressive civilization that was being constructed on top of it. That narrative was wrong. It was factually wrong in its description of what pre-contact Canada actually was, but it was functionally powerful in organizing the priorities of the people who acted on it. At the deepest level, the answer is epistemological. The categories through which the colonial and post-colonial institutions of Canada have understood the world have not, until relatively recently, included adequate frameworks for taking seriously the kinds of knowledge and the kinds of history that the deep past of the Canadian landscape represents. Academic disciplines define knowledge in ways that privilege certain kinds of evidence, certain kinds of sources, and certain kinds of questions. The oral traditions of Indigenous peoples were classified as mythology rather than history. The material culture of pre-contact peoples was classified as primitive rather than sophisticated. The landscapes they had shaped were classified as natural rather than cultural. Those classifications are changing, not as fast as they need to, but meaningfully. The academic disciplines are reconsidering their epistemological frameworks. The legal and regulatory systems are beginning to provide more robust protection for Indigenous heritage. The public understanding of pre-contact North America is slowly becoming more accurate and more nuanced, and the voices of Indigenous peoples, who have always known that the conventional narrative was wrong, are being heard in broader forums. But the ground beneath the cities remains largely as it was. The buried layers of thousands of years of human occupation are still there, in most cases inaccessible, their information still locked in the soil and sediment and stone and organic material that has accumulated in those underground spaces over the millennia. The raising of the streets, the laying of the foundations, the threading of the utilities, all of it has created a situation in which accessing that information requires dealing with the full weight of the urban development above, not metaphorically, but physically. Some of that information is lost beyond recovery. The disturbance caused by urban development over the past century and a half has been too great, too thorough, too destructive of context to allow reconstruction of the records of what was there. But some of it is preserved, in pockets of undisturbed soil beneath the foundations, in the fills that sealed the original ground surface rather than disturbing it, in the features that survived because they were either very deep or very robust. And new technologies are beginning to make it possible to investigate those preserved contexts without the full disruptive burden of traditional excavation. Ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR, magnetometry, electrical resistivity tomography. All of these are tools that can reveal subsurface features without removing the soil above them. They cannot replace excavation as a means of recovering the full range of information from archaeological deposits, but they can map the extent and character of those deposits, can identify the locations of significant features beneath the urban surface, can help archaeologists prioritize where to focus their limited resources when opportunities for investigation do arise. The application of these technologies to the buried landscapes of Canadian cities is still in its early stages, but where it has been applied, the results have been striking. Features that appeared on no historical map, that were not predicted by any documentary source, have emerged from the subsurface data as clear signatures of past activity. The ground, scanned by modern instruments, reveals what it contains. What it contains, in city after city, is history. Deep, layered, complex, surprising history. History that challenges the conventional narrative. History that enriches our understanding of what this land was before the cities came. History that, if we are willing to pay attention to it, changes the way we relate to the places we call home. The northern dimension of this story is the one most rarely told, and in some ways, the most extraordinary. The conventional image of pre-contact Canada assigns the north, the boreal forest, the tundra, the Arctic archipelago, to small numbers of highly mobile peoples living in extreme conditions, with a material culture necessarily stripped down to the essentials of survival in an unforgiving environment. That image is not entirely wrong. The North is indeed a place of extreme conditions, and the peoples who have lived there have developed adaptations to those conditions that represent some of the most remarkable achievements of human cultural evolution. But the image is wrong in its suggestion that the North was therefore simple, that the complexity of pre-contact life was limited to the areas where conditions were less demanding. The peoples of the boreal forest and the tundra and the Arctic were not simple. They were sophisticated in ways appropriate to their environment, possessed of knowledge systems of extraordinary depth and precision, organized in social forms that were adapted to the requirements of life in the North. The Thule culture, the ancestors of the modern Inuit, is the most dramatic example. The Thule expanded eastward from Alaska across the Canadian Arctic beginning around 1000 CE, reaching Greenland by approximately 1300 CE. In the space of 3 centuries, they colonized one of the most challenging environments on Earth, displacing the earlier Dorset culture peoples who had occupied the eastern Arctic for approximately 4,000 years. Their expansion was made possible by a technology centered on the umiak and the dog sled, and the sophisticated exploitation of marine mammals, including the bowhead whale, that was so effective in the conditions of the high Arctic that it simply outcompeted everything that had come before. The Thule were not a Stone Age culture in the dismissive sense that phrase often carries. They were sophisticated engineers, marine biologists, and geographers of the Arctic. Their knowledge of sea ice conditions, of the movement of marine mammals, of the relationship between seasonal light and temperature and ecological productivity, was the product of millennia of accumulated observation and experimentation. When European explorers arrived in the eastern Arctic, they were in a very real sense entering a landscape that the Thule and their descendants had already mapped and understood more thoroughly than any outsider could. And beneath the Thule, there is the Dorset. The Dorset culture, which preceded the Thule in the eastern Arctic and which was displaced by the Thule expansion, is one of the most mysterious and least understood cultures in North American pre-contact history. The Dorset persisted in the eastern Arctic for approximately 4,000 years, from roughly 800 BCE to 1300 CE. During that time, they developed a material culture of considerable sophistication, including some of the most remarkable small sculpture produced anywhere in pre-contact North America. The carved ivory and bone objects produced by Dorset artists, the tiny human and animal figures, with their precise detail and their frequently unsettling expressiveness, are among the most powerful works of pre-Columbian North American art. What the Dorset believed, how they organized their social life, what their oral traditions contained, is almost entirely lost. The Thule expansion apparently did not involve significant genetic or cultural mixing with the Dorset. The Thule and the Dorset seem to have been essentially separate populations that existed in the same landscape for a period of uncertain length before the Dorset disappeared. The causes and mechanisms of the Dorset disappearance are not understood. Climate change, competition for resources, epidemic disease, direct conflict. All of these have been proposed, and none has been definitively established. What remains of the Dorset is what is in the ground. Their occupation sites, their refuse heaps, the caches of objects they buried or abandoned, the carvings that have survived in the permafrost conditions of the Arctic, where organic materials are preserved by cold rather than destroyed by it. Those remains are, in many cases, remarkably well preserved. The permafrost of the Arctic is a natural archive of extraordinary quality, preserving organic materials that would have decayed to nothing in more temperate conditions. The permafrost sites of the Canadian Arctic contain, in their frozen interiors, materials going back thousands of years in states of preservation that would be impossible in any other environment. Wood, leather, bone, plant material, all of these survive in permafrost in conditions that allow their original character to be recovered in remarkable detail. And the thawing of the permafrost that is occurring as a result of contemporary climate change is releasing some of these preserved materials from their frozen contexts. In some cases, that thawing is revealing things that have been hidden for hundreds or thousands of years. In others, it is destroying preserved materials by exposing them to temperatures that allow decomposition to begin. The Arctic permafrost, in other words, is an archive that is simultaneously being opened by technology and by climate change, and threatened by the same climate change that is opening it. The race to document and recover what is being revealed before deterioration destroys it is one of the more urgent challenges in contemporary Canadian archaeology. Let's return to the cities one more time, to the streets that were razed, to the layers beneath them, to the question of what it means to live in a place whose deep history is sealed under your feet, accessible in imagination but inaccessible in the physical world, present in the traditions of the peoples who have the longest connection to the landscape, but absent from the self-understanding of the city above. There is something philosophically significant about the underground layers of a city. They represent, in a very concrete sense, the relationship between the present and the past. The city above exists because of what happened in those layers. The drainage pattern that determine where flooding occurs were established over thousands of years by natural processes and then modified by millennia of human activity before the city was ever dreamed of. The topography that the city was built on was shaped by glaciation and by the slower processes of post-glacial adjustment, but also by the activities of the people who lived on it before the settlers came. The very character of the soil, its chemistry, its structure, its biological community, was shaped by those thousands of years of prior occupation. The city is not built on empty ground. It is built on the accumulated record of everything that happened before. And that record, however imperfectly preserved, however partially accessible, however thoroughly covered over by the weight of the urban present, is still there. The past is not gone, it is underground. This is not simply a metaphor, it is a physical reality. The soil beneath the streets of Toronto and Montreal and Vancouver contains organic material that was deposited there by people who lived on those sites thousands of years ago. The carbon in that organic material can be dated by radiocarbon methods. The objects embedded in that soil can be identified and described and placed in their proper archaeological context. The information they carry about the lives of the people who deposited them can be recovered, partially and imperfectly, but genuinely and substantively. The past is not gone, it is underground. And the underground past of Canada's cities is, by any measure, remarkable. It is remarkable for its depth, extending back in many cases 10,000 years or more. It is remarkable for its complexity, reflecting the long sequence of cultural traditions that have occupied the Canadian landscape across those 10,000 years. It is remarkable for what it says about the sophistication and the adaptability and the sheer intellectual achievement of the peoples who created it. What it says, if we are willing to listen to what the ground has to say, is that the story of Canada did not begin in 1534 when Jacques Cartier sailed up the St. Lawrence, or in 1608 when Champlain founded Quebec, or in 1749 when Cornwallis established Halifax, or in 1791 when the Constitutional Act created Upper and Lower Canada. The story of Canada began at least 12,000 years ago when the first peoples arrived on the post-glacial landscape and began the long process of learning it, inhabiting it, shaping it, and being shaped by it that has continued, in various forms, ever since. The cities built over the past 4 centuries are not the story of Canada. They are the most recent chapter of a much longer story. A story whose earlier chapters are buried under the streets but not lost, waiting, with the patience that only the earth can sustain, for the attention that they deserve. The summer of 1954 was hot in southern Ontario, and the construction crew working on a new subdivision on the outskirts of what was then the town of Scarborough was not paying much attention to what the excavating equipment was turning up. They were building houses. That was the job. The soil they were moving was just soil. Except, it was not just soil. It was the midfield of a major Iroquoian village site, a large pre-contact settlement that had been occupied for approximately 200 years, sometime between 1400 and 1650 CE, and that contained, in its considerable extent, an extraordinary record of late pre-contact life in the Toronto region. The site, which archaeologists would eventually call the Hood site, was not entirely destroyed by the subdivision development. Enough of it survived, in areas where houses were not placed and basements were not dug, to allow subsequent archaeological investigation to recover a substantial body of information about the community that had lived there. That investigation, conducted in the decades following the subdivision's construction, produced evidence of a village of perhaps 1,500 people, enclosed by a double palisade containing longhouses of various sizes, with a material culture that reflected both local traditions and contact with a broader regional exchange network. The Hood site is not unique. It is one of dozens of major Iroquoian village sites that have been identified in the Greater Toronto region, ranging in date from roughly 900 CE to the contact period. Some of those sites were entirely destroyed by development. Some were partially investigated before or during development. A small number have been preserved, at least in part, as heritage sites. Together, they represent the evidence for a densely occupied, socially complex, culturally sophisticated human landscape that existed in the Toronto region for approximately 700 years before the first Europeans arrived. 700 years of complex, organized, agriculturally based village life in what is now the Toronto region, populations that, in some of the larger villages, may have exceeded 2,000 people. A regional system of communities connected by political alliance, ceremonial exchange, and marriage patterns that created a web of social relationships across the entire northern shore of Lake Ontario and beyond. All of that, underground, beneath the suburban sprawl and the retail strips and the highway infrastructure that now covers the landscape on which those communities lived. The archaeologists who have spent their careers trying to understand that buried landscape describe it with something close to reverence, not because they are romanticizing the past, but because the scale and complexity of what was there and the contrast between that complexity and the almost complete invisibility of pre-contact Ontario in the public imagination is genuinely striking. The people who built those villages were not primitive. They were sophisticated. They were organized. They had rich ceremonial and artistic traditions. They were engaged with the broader world of their time in ways that connected them to the great social currents flowing through pre-contact North America. And then, within a remarkably short period in the early 17th century, it was over. The Iroquoian communities of the northern Lake Ontario shore and the Petun and Huron communities of the Simcoe County area to the north were devastated by a combination of epidemic disease, disruption of traditional economic patterns by the fur trade, and eventually direct military attack by Haudenosaunee forces from south of the lake. Within a generation, the communities that had occupied the Toronto region for 700 years were gone, dispersed, destroyed. The landscape they left behind was interpreted by the European settlers who arrived a few decades later as empty wilderness. It was not wilderness, it was a post-catastrophe landscape, a place where an entire civilization, or at least an entire regional civilization, had recently been destroyed, where the physical evidence of that civilization remained in the soil, waiting to be found, where the forests that had grown up over the abandoned fields and the crumbled walls of the palisades gave the deceptive appearance of a primeval landscape untouched by human hand. The deception was complete enough to last for generations. The myth of the empty land, the terra nullius that colonial legal theory required to justify the expropriation of indigenous territory, found its apparent confirmation in a landscape that looked natural because the communities that had shaped it had been so recently and so thoroughly destroyed. Understanding that, feeling the weight of what that story means, is not simply an exercise in historical knowledge. It is a different way of being in the places we call home. It is the recognition that the landscape beneath our feet has a story that we are only beginning to learn how to read. A story that stretches back not decades or centuries but millennia. A story that is, in the most literal possible sense, still present, still underground, still waiting. The Great Lakes region, considered as a whole, is one of the most archaeologically significant landscapes in North America. The lakes themselves are relatively young in geological terms, formed by the retreat of the Laurentide ice sheet roughly 12,000 years ago, but the landscape around them has been continuously inhabited since shortly after that formation. The combination of the lake's ecological productivity, their role as corridors for movement and communication, and the diversity of the terrestrial environments around them, made the Great Lakes region one of the most attractive and most contested landscapes in pre-contact North America. The evidence for that attraction and that contestation is written in the archaeological record across the entire region, and particularly in the Canadian portion, the northern shore of the lakes, from the Niagara Peninsula to the Sewell and beyond. That record reflects, in its complexity and its depth, a genuinely extraordinary human history. The copper culture of the Great Lakes is one of the most remarkable phenomena in the pre-contact archaeology of the continent. The peoples who developed the so-called Old Copper Complex, centered on the Lake Superior Basin but extending through the broader Great Lakes region and into adjacent areas, were working native copper, the naturally occurring metallic copper found in the Lake Superior region, into tools, ornaments, and prestige objects beginning approximately 8,000 years ago. 8,000 years ago. That is roughly contemporary with the earliest metalworking in the Old World. The Old Copper Complex objects, when they have been found in good archaeological context, are remarkable for the sophistication of their manufacture. The copper was worked cold, hammered, and shaped without the application of heat, into forms that demonstrate a profound understanding of the metal's properties. Spear points, knives, gouges, awls, needles, fish hooks, bracelets, and beads. All of these were produced by Old Copper Complex craftspeople with a technical mastery that testifies to a deep tradition of knowledge and practice. The distribution of Old Copper Complex objects across the pre-contact archaeological record of Eastern North America is one of the clearest demonstrations of the extent and effectiveness of the long-distance exchange networks that characterized the period. Copper from Lake Superior appears in context from the Gulf Coast to the Maritime Provinces, from the eastern seaboard to the western plains. The movement of that copper over distances of hundreds or thousands of kilometers in a world without wheeled transport or navigable waterways connected to the distant destinations required organized systems of exchange, capable of maintaining relationships across remarkable distances. The peoples who organized and participated in those systems were not simple wanderers. They were the participants in what was, effectively, the first continental-scale exchange economy in North American history. An economy that moved not just copper, but ideas, artistic traditions, ceremonial practices, and symbolic systems, along with the physical materials. An economy that created connections between communities separated by vast distances and maintained those connections across generations. The evidence for that economy is in the ground across Canada, in the material from pre-contact sites that contains objects from distant sources, in the presence of Lake Superior copper, in maritime archaic burials on the Atlantic coast, in the presence of marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico, in Hopewell contexts in Ontario, in the presence of obsidian from Yellowstone, in sites much further east than simple drift would explain. The ground holds the evidence of a continental scale of human engagement that the conventional narrative of pre-contact Canada has consistently undersold. And beneath all of that, in the deepest layers, in the earliest post-glacial contexts, the evidence of the very first peoples on the landscape, the Paleo-Indian hunters, who followed the retreating glaciers northward, who were present on the landscape of what is now Ontario and Quebec and the Atlantic provinces within 1,000 years of the ice's retreat, who were hunting megafauna and learning a completely new landscape in conditions of radical environmental change. Their traces are the hardest to find, the most fragile, the most easily destroyed. But where they survive, in the rare contexts where the subsequent 12,000 years of occupation and development have not obliterated them, they remind us of how long this story actually is. 12,000 years, 240 generations, assuming a generation of 50 years. 240 successions of parents teaching children, of knowledge being transmitted, of relationships between people and landscape being developed and refined and passed on. 240 chapters, each one as full of life and complexity and meaning as any chapter of recorded human history, each one largely invisible to us, because the frameworks through which we understand the past have not, until very recently, been adequate to perceive them. The night is deepest now. Whatever you were thinking about before this began has, perhaps, receded a little. The day is done, the city is quieter, and somewhere beneath you, wherever you are, the earth holds its archives in the patient dark. The streets were raised in Canadian cities for practical reasons: flooding, sanitation, infrastructure. The people who raised them were not thinking about what they were covering up. They were thinking about the future, about the city they were building, about the problems they were solving. They did not pause to consider that what they were burying was history, that the soil they were filling over was not empty but occupied, not blank but written, not beginning but already deep into a story whose earlier chapters they had no framework for reading. That is not an indictment of those people. It is simply a description of the epistemological and cultural situation they were in. They understood the world in the way the world was understood in their time. And in their time, the past that mattered was the past that had been written down, the past that had left stone buildings and written records, the past that fit the categories their civilization had developed for organizing and valuing historical information. The past that was in the ground beneath their feet did not fit those categories. It was too old. It was too different. It belonged to people whose historical significance the culture of the 19th century was not equipped to recognize, so it was covered over, and the streets went in, and the city grew, and the buried past was sealed under the weight of everything that came after. But the past does not disappear. It goes underground. It waits. And eventually, slowly, imperfectly, the surface begins to come to terms with what is underneath. The laws change to require at least minimal consideration of what construction might be destroying. The academic disciplines develop frameworks capable of taking seriously the kinds of history that the buried layers represent. The descendants of the peoples who made those buried layers find ways to make their knowledge and their connection to those landscapes heard in forums that previously excluded them. The process is slow. It is incomplete. It is, in many respects, inadequate to the scale of what was buried and what was lost. But it is happening. The understanding is growing. The listening is beginning. And somewhere beneath the streets of every Canadian city, the earth is still holding what it has always held: the tools, the hearths, the middens, the graves, the post molds, the floor surfaces, the layers of ash and bone and plant material and stone that represent the accumulated evidence of 10,000 years and more of human life on this land. 10,000 years of people waking up and facing the day, of people feeding their children and tending their fires, and going out to gather and hunt and fish and trade and make art and conduct ceremonies and tell stories and bury their dead and argue and love and grieve and celebrate. 10,000 years of all of that, sealed beneath the concrete and asphalt of cities that were built with almost no awareness of what was there before. The streets were raised. What is beneath them has never been fully shown. What is beneath them is, in a very real sense, who we are, where we actually come from, how long this place has been a place where people lived, how deep the human connection to this landscape actually goes. That connection is not something that began when the first European settlements were established. It is something that has been accumulating for 10,000 years. And the people who have the deepest and longest part of that connection, the Indigenous peoples of Canada, have always known it. They have always known how long their relationship with this land has been. They have always known what lies beneath the streets that were laid over their ancestors' places. The question is whether the rest of us are finally ready to listen. to take seriously what the ground has to say, to let the buried past of the landscape we inhabit change the way we understand where we are and how long this place has been home to human beings? The answer, slowly and imperfectly, is beginning to be yes. The stories are coming back up into the light. The archived mysteries are being opened. The patient earth is, finally, beginning to be heard. And tonight, wherever you are listening from, whether you are in one of the cities built on those buried landscapes or somewhere else entirely, you are now part of that growing awareness. You know something about what lies beneath. You know that the ground your city is built on has a history much longer and much stranger and much richer than the official story acknowledges. You know that the streets were raised. You know something, now, of what is beneath them. Let that knowledge settle in with you as sleep comes. Let it change, just a little, the way you think about the ground you walk on. The earth beneath every Canadian city has been carrying these stories for thousands of years. It will go on carrying them, patient and full, for as long as there is ground to carry them. The buried past is not going anywhere. It is right there, beneath your feet, in the dark, holding what it has always held, waiting, as the earth always waits, for the long future to come into being above it. Sleep well. The stories will be here in the morning. They have been here for 10,000 years. They are not going anywhere, and neither are you. There is a town in northern Ontario called Kenora that sits at the outlet of Lake of the Woods, the enormous, island-studded lake that straddles the border between Ontario and Manitoba. The town is not large. It serves the surrounding region as a hub for the resource industries that have defined northern Ontario's economy for the past century, and as a gateway for the recreational tourism that the lake's extraordinary beauty makes possible. In the context of Canadian history as it is conventionally told, Kenora is a relatively recent place, a product of the railway era, of the logging and mining booms of the late 19th century. But the area around Kenora and Lake of the Woods has been a significant human landscape for a very long time. The Anishinaabe people have lived in this region for centuries, and their connection to Lake of the Woods is deep and ancient. The lake's name in Ojibwe, Pikangikum, reflects a relationship with this specific body of water that goes back much further than the colonial period. And in the rock faces that line the lake shores, visible from canoes and motorboats navigating its channels, there are images that provide a window into that deep past. The pictographs of Lake of the Woods are among the most remarkable examples of pre-contact rock art in Canada, painted in red ochre on the exposed granite faces that the retreating glaciers left along the lake's shores. These images depict human figures, animals, canoes, celestial objects, and abstract designs whose full meaning remains incompletely understood. They were made over a long period of time, with some images dating back perhaps 3,000 years and others apparently more recent. And they were made by people who understood this specific landscape with an intimacy and depth that no amount of modern scholarship can fully replicate. The pictographs are not simply art in the decorative sense. They are documents, they are records, in a visual medium, of what mattered to the people who made them. The animals they depict are not random choices. The placement of the images on specific rock faces, at specific heights above the water, in specific relationships to the landscape features around them, reflects knowledge and intention. These are not casual marks. They are the product of communities that had developed, over generations, a sophisticated understanding of the landscape and a rich tradition of encoding that understanding in visual form on the landscape itself. Similar pictograph traditions exist throughout the Canadian Shield, the vast area of ancient Precambrian rock that underlies the northern portions of Ontario, Quebec, and Manitoba and extends into the other northern provinces. The Shield was not a barrier to human occupation. It was a landscape that the peoples who knew it could navigate and inhabit with remarkable effectiveness. Its lakes and rivers provided routes of communication and travel. Its rocks provided materials for tools. Its forests provided game and plant resources. Its sheltered bays and river mouths provided locations for camps and villages. And in many places across the Shield, the rock faces of those sheltered bays and river mouths carry the pictographs that are the visible surface of a much deeper cultural tradition. The tradition of which the pictographs are the most visible expression was one that engaged intimately with the spiritual and symbolic dimensions of the landscape, that understood the specific rocks and waters and forests of the Shield not as generic natural features, but as particular places with their own histories, their own powers, their own presences. The Anishinaabe concept of Manidug, the spiritual presences or powers that inhabit specific places and specific kinds of things, gives some sense of the framework within which the pictograph tradition operated. The rock faces on which the pictographs were painted were not arbitrary surfaces. They were locations where the boundary between the everyday world and the spirit world was understood to be thin, where communication between human beings and the Manidug was possible. Placing an image on such a rock face was not simply an act of artistic expression. It was an act of engagement with the spiritual geography of the landscape. That spiritual geography, encoded in the pictographs and in the oral traditions that explain and contextualize them, is a form of mapping. A map not of the physical landscape in the conventional cartographic sense, but of the landscape understood in its full complexity as a place where human beings, animals, rocks, water, and spiritual presences all inhabit the same world and stand in relationship to each other. A map that, for the peoples who knew how to read it, provided orientation not just in physical space, but in the full cosmological space in which they understood themselves to be living. This is sophisticated. It is not the simple Stone Age imagery that the conventional narrative of pre-contact Canada would lead us to expect. It reflects a tradition of thought and knowledge that is, by any reasonable measure, philosophically rich and intellectually complex. And it is present across the Canadian Shield in hundreds of pictograph sites, many of them known to local Indigenous communities, some of them documented by researchers, others still largely unknown, except to those who have reason to navigate the specific reaches of Shield Lakes where they are found. The question of what lies beneath the streets of Canadian cities connects, in ways that are not always immediately obvious, to the question of what lies beneath the surface of the Shield itself. The two landscapes, the urban and the boreal, seem utterly different, but they share a common history in the sense that both have been shaped by the same long human engagement with the Canadian landscape, and both contain traces of that engagement that have been systematically undervalued. The mines that have been dug through the Shield in pursuit of the copper and nickel and gold and uranium and other mineral resources that underlie it have created, almost accidentally, some of the most extensive underground access to the pre-contact past of the region. Mining operations go deep, very deep, and as they go down, they pass through the geological record of the past in ways that sometimes produce unexpected encounters with evidence of much more recent activity. Mine shafts in the Sudbury Basin, following veins of nickel and copper through the shattered rock of the basin's ancient geological structure, have occasionally broken into cavities and passages that were not created by the mining operations themselves. Some of these are natural features, the products of geological processes over billions of years, but others have characteristics that suggest they were created, or at minimum used, by human beings at some point in the past. The exact nature of what has been found in some of these anomalous cavities is not something that the mining companies involved have been eager to publicize. Mining operations are complex, expensive, and subject to regulatory oversight that companies generally prefer not to complicate with unexpected archaeological discoveries. The practical result is that some of what has been encountered underground in the course of mining the Shield has been documented very briefly, if at all, and the documentation has not been made widely available. What can be said with confidence is that the native copper deposits of the Lake Superior region and the broader copper-bearing areas of the Canadian Shield were known and worked by pre-contact peoples for thousands of years. The old copper complex, which we discussed earlier, drew on Shield copper resources in a systematic and organized way. The people who worked those copper deposits had to have accessed them somehow. They had to have identified the locations of surface exposures. They had to have developed methods for extracting the copper from those exposures. And in at least some cases, they had to have followed the copper below the surface. The extent to which pre-contact peoples engaged in what could be called mining, the systematic extraction of subsurface mineral resources, is a question that mainstream archaeology has engaged with inconsistently. There is clear evidence from various parts of the world, including North America, of pre-contact peoples extracting flint and obsidian from deep surface quarries. There is evidence of pre-contact peoples following copper veins below the surface in the Lake Superior region specifically. And there are, in the oral traditions of some of the peoples of the Great Lakes region, references to underground places and underground resources that suggest a knowledge of the subsurface that goes beyond simple surface observation. The combination of those oral tradition references and the physical evidence from mining operations is suggestive but not conclusive. What it suggests is that the story of human engagement with the underground in Canada is not simply a story of graves and buried middens and sealed occupation layers. It may also be a story of deliberate underground activity, of pre-contact people going down into the earth in pursuit of resources, of a relationship with the subsurface that was not simply passive, but active and intentional. That possibility adds another dimension to the question of what lies beneath. Not just what the earth accidentally covered over the passive accumulation of occupation debris and buried features, but what people deliberately placed underground, what they brought down, what they found there, what they left. The archaeology of death in pre-contact Canada is a subject that requires care and sensitivity, because the burials of pre-contact peoples are, for the contemporary communities descended from those peoples, not simply archaeological data, but the physical remains of ancestors. The treatment of those remains, and the question of who has the right to make decisions about how they are studied and how they are cared for, is one of the most contentious and most important conversations in contemporary Canadian archaeology. But the burial record, considered with appropriate respect and within appropriate ethical frameworks, is also one of the richest sources of information we have about the deep past of the Canadian landscape. The practice of burying the dead with care, and in many traditions with grave goods that reflect the life of the deceased and the beliefs of the community about what happens after death, creates an archaeological record of extraordinary richness. The diversity of burial practices across pre-contact Canada reflects the diversity of the cultural traditions that inhabited the landscape. The red ochre burials of the Maritime Archaic, with their elaborate treatment of the body and their often extraordinary grave goods. The ossuaries of the Huron-Wendat, the great communal reburials in which the remains of all those who had died since the previous ceremony were gathered and interred together in a ceremony of enormous social significance. The scaffold burials of the Plains peoples, in which the dead were placed in elevated positions to return gradually to the earth through the processes of natural decay. Each of these traditions reflects a distinct set of beliefs about the nature of death and the relationship between the living and the dead. Each of them has left a distinct kind of archaeological signature, and each of them has been, to varying degrees, disturbed and disrupted by the development that has swept across the Canadian landscape over the past 4 centuries. The disruption of burial sites, whether in the context of urban development or agricultural activity, or simply the passage of unknowing feet over ground that contains the remains of the dead, is something that the descended communities feel with particular sharpness. The bones of ancestors are not simply historical artifacts. They are the physical remains of people who lived and loved and contributed to the communities that still exist. The respect that the living owe to those remains is not simply a matter of legal obligation or professional ethics. It is a matter of fundamental human decency. And the degree to which that decency has been absent from much of the development history of Canada, the degree to which the remains of pre-contact peoples have been disturbed, scattered, and in some cases, used as curiosities or display objects in ways that no community would tolerate for the remains of more recently deceased members of recognized communities, is a measure of how far the conventional approach to pre-contact history has fallen short of adequate ethical standards. The legal frameworks governing the treatment of burial remains in Canada have changed substantially in recent decades. The recognition that Indigenous communities have rights with respect to the human remains of their ancestors, and with respect to the sacred objects and items of cultural patrimony that have been removed from their original contexts and placed in museum collections, has been growing both in law and in practice. The repatriation of human remains and cultural objects to the communities from which they came is now an ongoing process, imperfect and incomplete, but moving in a direction that represents a meaningful improvement over the situation that prevailed for most of the colonial period. What that process of repatriation means for understanding the deep past of Canada is complex. It does not mean that the burial record becomes inaccessible as a source of historical information. It means that the way that information is accessed and used changes fundamentally, becoming a collaborative process in which descended communities are partners rather than objects of study. That change, while it requires significant adjustments in how archaeological practice works, is ultimately not a loss, but a gain, because the perspectives and the knowledge that descended communities bring to the interpretation of ancestral burial sites is itself a form of historical information that the purely material-focused approach of conventional archaeology cannot provide. The bones and the objects that come out of the ground carry information. The oral traditions and the cultural knowledge of the descended communities carry information. The combination of those two streams of information, when they can be brought together in a genuinely respectful and collaborative way, produces a richer and more complete picture of the past than either can provide alone. The mounds. That is something that tends to get left out of the standard account of pre-contact Canada. The earthen mounds, the deliberately constructed landforms that represent one of the most visible and most dramatic forms of pre-contact landscape modification in North America, are most strongly associated in the public imagination with the Mississippi Valley and the American Southeast. Cahokia, Poverty Point, the Serpent Mound of Ohio, these are the names that come to mind when people think of pre-contact mound building. But mounds were built in Canada too, not on the same scale as Cahokia, not with the same level of monumental ambition as the great ceremonial centers of the American Southeast, but built deliberately, with effort and intention, in forms that reflect the ceremonial and cosmological traditions of the peoples who built them. The Serpent Mounds of Rice Lake in Ontario are the most famous Canadian example. Located on a peninsula that juts into Rice Lake, a broad, shallow body of water southeast of Peterborough, the Serpent Mounds are a complex of 9 mounds, including one sinuous mound, approximately 60 meters in length, that does indeed suggest the form of a serpent. The mounds were built roughly 2,000 years ago by peoples associated with the Point Peninsula culture, a woodland period tradition that shows connections to the broader Hopewell Exchange network of the Ohio Valley. The Serpent Mounds were used for burial and apparently for ceremony over an extended period. The burials recovered from them when the site was first investigated in the early 20th century reflected a community with access to trade goods from distant sources, with a ceremonial tradition that placed significant value on the treatment of the dead, and with a knowledge of the landscape that led them to choose this specific peninsula on this specific lake as the location for their most significant ritual construction. Why this peninsula? Why this lake? The answer is probably multiple and probably not fully recoverable from the archaeological evidence alone. The peninsula's position, surrounded on 3 sides by water, may have been significant in a cosmological sense. The lake's productivity as a resource, the abundance of fish and waterfowl and plant foods that would have supported the communities that used the site, may have been part of the calculus. The visibility of the site from the water and of the mounds from a distance across the lake's surface may have served important social and political functions in marking the territory and the claims of the communities that built them. The Serpent Mounds are now a provincial park, protected and accessible to the public. They are one of the places in Canada where the pre-contact past is visible at the surface, where you can stand and see with your own eyes the deliberate human modification of the landscape that represents the work of communities living here 2,000 years ago. They are, in a very real sense, the opposite of buried. They project upward from the landscape rather than being sealed beneath it. But they are not the only mounds in Canada. Similar constructions, smaller and less well known, exist at various points across southern Ontario, in the Upper Great Lakes region, and in the eastern Prairie provinces. Some of them are well documented. Others are known only to local communities. Some are in good condition. Others have been ploughed flat by agriculture or graded away by development. The mound-building tradition, of which the Serpent Mounds are the most visible Canadian expression, was more widespread and more significant in the human history of the landscape than the conventional narrative acknowledges. Understanding that tradition, and understanding its connections to the broader patterns of woodland period cultural development across eastern North America, requires looking at what is in the ground as well as what projects above it. The mounds that survive at the surface are the tips of archaeological icebergs, whose bulk lies in the subsurface deposits that surround and underlie them. The fill of the mounds themselves, the layers in which the burials were placed and the ceremonies were conducted, contains information about the communities that built them. that is as detailed and as revealing as anything you will find in any written historical record of a similar period. The archaeological work of the past several decades has been, in many ways, a slow revolution in the understanding of pre-contact Canada. The methodological tools have improved dramatically. The interpretive frameworks have become more sophisticated. The range of questions being asked has expanded to include dimensions of pre-contact life, the social, the symbolic, the ecological, that earlier generations of researchers were not equipped to investigate, and the collaborative relationships with Indigenous communities that are now, at least in the more progressive corners of the field, recognized as essential to adequate practice, that have begun to bring perspectives and knowledge to bear on the archaeological record that transform what can be understood from it. But the revolution is slow, and the ground beneath the cities keeps being covered over. Each new construction project that moves without adequate archaeological investigation is a permanent loss. Each site that gets sealed under new development before it has been properly documented is a chapter that will never be read. The pace of development across Canada has been, over the past several decades, consistently faster than the pace at which the archaeological heritage of the country has been documented and protected. The gap between what is being lost and what is being preserved is not a gap that can be closed by archaeology alone. It requires changes in law, in practice, in the priorities that governments and institutions and private developers bring to the management of the built environment. It requires a broader public understanding of what is at stake when development disturbs pre-contact archaeological sites. It requires the recognition, at the level of policy and practice, that the heritage represented by those sites is not merely the property of the academic discipline that studies it, or of the communities most directly descended from the people who created it, but belongs, in a meaningful sense, to everyone who has any relationship to the landscape of Canada. That recognition is beginning to take hold, slowly, unevenly, but it is there. The environmental assessment processes that govern major development projects in Canada now routinely include requirements for archaeological survey and assessment. The heritage protection legislation of the various provinces has been strengthened in recent decades, though it remains far from adequate in many jurisdictions. The practice of consultation with Indigenous communities on development projects that might affect archaeological sites is now required in many contexts, and the quality of that consultation is, in the better examples, genuinely improving. These are not small changes. They represent a significant shift from the situation that prevailed as recently as the 1970s, when most Canadian development projects proceeded with essentially no consideration of the archaeological heritage that might be affected. The fact that the shift has been partial and inconsistent, that it has been resisted in many contexts, and that the enforcement of heritage protection requirements is often inadequate, does not negate the significance of the direction of travel. The ground beneath the cities will not give up all its secrets, even if we develop perfect methodological tools and a perfectly supportive legal and institutional framework. Too much has been destroyed. Too many layers have been irreversibly disturbed by the development of the past century and a half. The record of pre-contact Canada, buried under the streets and the foundations of the cities, is incomplete and will remain incomplete. But incomplete is not the same as empty. What remains, even after all the disturbance and destruction of the development era, is still substantial, still capable of telling us things we do not know, still capable of changing, in meaningful ways, the story we tell about this place and about the people who have lived here across the long millennia before the cities came. The light does not reach underground, down in the soil layers beneath the city, where the artifacts and the features of the pre-contact past have been lying for hundreds or thousands of years. There is no light. Just the darkness of the earth and the slow work of chemical and biological processes on the materials that were deposited there by people who lived their lives in the full light of the sky above. That darkness is not simply the absence of light. It is, in a very real sense, the presence of time. In the darkness beneath the city, time works differently than it does on the surface. Things that would be destroyed in a generation by exposure to air and moisture and the activity of the surface world can persist for millennia in the protected environment of the subsurface. Organic materials that would rot away to nothing in months under surface conditions can survive for thousands of years in the right subsurface chemistry. The darkness is a preserver, a guardian, in a sense, of what was placed there. And what was placed there, by the people who lived on those landscapes before the cities covered them, was placed with intention. The burials were intentional. The middens were not random. The placement of hearths and storage pits and structural features was organized and purposeful. The people who created those deposits were not simply generating waste, they were making choices about how to live in the landscape. And those choices, encoded in the materials they left behind, carry information about who they were and how they lived. That information has been lying in the dark beneath the cities for centuries, waiting for the moment when it could be recovered and read. Some of it has been recovered in the excavations that have managed to reach the early layers. Some of it has been destroyed by construction before it could be recovered, and some of it is still there, in the dark, untouched and unread, holding its stories in the patient way that the earth holds everything. The stories the earth holds about what happened on the Canadian landscape before the cities came are extraordinary. They are the stories of maritime peoples who navigated the open Atlantic in pursuit of swordfish and whales, of plains peoples who organized the pursuit of bison across the grassland in coordinated hunts that required hundreds of people working in precisely defined roles, of woodland peoples who built elaborate ceremonial complexes and maintained exchange networks spanning the continent, of boreal forest peoples who encoded their knowledge of the landscape in pictographs on the rocks of shield lakes, of Arctic peoples who colonized one of the most challenging environments on Earth with a technology of extraordinary effectiveness. These are not small stories, they are not marginal stories, they are the stories of this place, the stories of how this land became what it is, the stories of the people who knew this landscape in its full depth and complexity before the cities covered the ground and the conventional history began. The streets were raised in every major Canadian city during the development of the colonial and post-colonial period. What is beneath them has never been fully shown, because the tools to show it have only recently become available, and because the institutional and cultural will to do the showing has only recently begun to develop. But the showing is beginning. The ground is being read, where it can be reached. The stories are being recovered, where they have survived. And in the recovery of those stories, something important is happening. The place called Canada is becoming, slowly, more fully itself. The long history of the land is becoming more visible. The peoples whose presence here extends back 12,000 years are becoming more fully present in the understanding that Canadians have of the place they live. The depth of the human relationship with this landscape is becoming, gradually and imperfectly, more fully acknowledged. This is not simply an academic exercise. It is not simply a matter of correcting the historical record in the narrow sense of adding more footnotes to the scholarly literature. It is, in a deeper sense, about the kind of relationship that the people who live in this place have with the land they live on, about whether they understand themselves as recent arrivals on an empty landscape or as the current inhabitants of a landscape with a human history of extraordinary depth, about whether the cities they live in are understood as entirely new constructions or as the most recent layer in a sequence of human engagement with specific places that extends back thousands of years. That difference in self-understanding is not trivial. It affects the way people think about their responsibilities to the land, about the degree to which the landscape's non-human elements are understood as having histories and values of their own, about the kind of humility that is appropriate when making decisions that affect a landscape with such a long and complex human history. The ground beneath the streets knows these things. It has been holding them for a very long time. The question is whether we are finally ready to do the work of learning to hear what it has to say. Wherever you are lying right now, under whatever roof, in whatever city or town or countryside, the earth beneath you has a story. Maybe it has the story of the boreal forest and the peoples who knew it for millennia. Maybe it has the story of the plains bison hunters and the medicine wheel builders. Maybe it has the story of the coastal peoples and their long relationship with the Pacific's abundance. Maybe it has the story of the eastern woodland villages and the great exchange networks of the Hopewell world. Maybe it has the story of the maritime archaic red paint people and their extraordinary relationship with the Atlantic Sea. All of those stories are true. All of them are there, in the ground, in varying states of preservation and accessibility. All of them are part of the deep history of this place. And none of them are finished. None of them have reached their conclusion. The peoples whose ancestors made those stories are still here. The landscape those peoples shaped still bears the marks of their shaping. The knowledge those peoples developed still lives in the traditions and the practices and the oral literatures that have been maintained across the generations. The streets were raised. What is beneath them has never been fully shown, but the showing is beginning. And when it is complete, when the full depth of what lies under those streets is finally understood and acknowledged and integrated into the way Canada understands itself, this will be a different country. Not just in its self-knowledge, but in its relationship to the land it occupies. In its sense of the obligations it owes to that land, and to the peoples whose connection to it extends back further than any other living community's connection. The earth is patient. It has been waiting for this for a very long time. And it will go on waiting, for as long as waiting is necessary, for the listening to catch up with what it has to say. Rest now. The night is deep. The ground beneath you is deep. And in the darkness below the surface, the long history of this place goes on holding itself in readiness for the day it is fully known. That day is coming, not as fast as it should, but it is coming. The stories of what lies beneath the raised streets of Canadian cities will be told. The buried past will come up into the light. The full depth of the human connection to this land will be acknowledged. Until then, the earth holds what it holds. Patient, silent, full. And you, in your sleep tonight, are part of the world that is slowly learning to listen to it. There is a particular phenomenon that geologists call isostatic rebound, when an enormous weight has been pressing on the Earth's crust for a very long time, and then that weight is removed. The crust begins, slowly and imperfectly, to return to its previous position. The land rises, not dramatically, not all at once, but measurably, steadily, over thousands of years. In the areas of Canada that were covered by the Laurentide ice sheet, the isostatic rebound that has been occurring since the glaciers retreated 12,000 years ago is still happening. The land in the Hudson Bay lowlands is rising at rates that geologists can measure with modern instruments. The landscape itself is recovering from the weight it carried. There is something almost poetic about that geological reality in the context of this story. The land of Canada has been carrying an enormous weight for the past 4 centuries. The weight of development and resource extraction and the physical mass of cities built on ground that was previously open. And beneath that weight, pressed down into the earth, is the accumulated record of 12,000 years of human occupation, the evidence of everything that happened here before the cities came. The isostatic rebound of geological understanding works slowly too. The recovery of the buried past, the raising of what has been pressed down under the weight of the conventional narrative, is a process that takes time and effort and the gradual shifting of institutional and cultural priorities, but it is happening. Like the land itself, the historical understanding of what Canada was before Canada is slowly rising. It is rising in the work of Indigenous communities who have never accepted the conventional narrative and who are now in a legal and political environment that has shifted significantly in their favour, able to advocate more effectively for the recognition of their deep connection to the landscape. It is rising in the work of archaeologists who are developing better tools and better collaborative practices and a better appreciation of the complexity of what they are trying to understand. It is rising in the broader public awareness that pre-contact North America was not simple or primitive or empty, that the peoples who inhabited this continent before European contact had developed ways of knowing and ways of living of genuine sophistication and richness. And it is rising too in the growing recognition that the cities themselves, for all the development that has covered the pre-contact landscape, are not entirely disconnected from the deep history of the places they occupy. The waterways that run through and under the cities follow paths shaped by thousands of years of pre-contact use. The topographic features that give the cities their character, the ravines and hills and lakefronts and river valleys, were known and used by pre-contact peoples whose understanding of those features was in many cases more sophisticated than anything the city's planners brought to their work. The very names that the cities have given to neighborhoods and landmarks and natural features, often corrupted or translated or replaced versions of indigenous place names, carry the faint echo of a prior geography of meaning. Toronto itself is thought by many scholars to derive from an Iroquoian word, possibly connected to the name of a fishing weir or a place where trees stand in water, though the etymology is disputed and probably not fully recoverable. Vancouver is built near the site that the Musqueam people called Exmouth-Atacoyam, a name that carries within it a geographical and historical depth that the English name of the city does not begin to approach. Montreal is built on the island the Haudenosaunee, called Tiotia, a name describing the place where the rivers divide, a perfectly precise description of the island's position at the confluence of the Ottawa and St. Lawrence rivers. Those names are not simply curiosities or historical footnotes. They are the surviving surface traces of an entire geographical vocabulary, a way of naming and knowing the landscape that encoded thousands of years of intimate observation and accumulated knowledge. The fact that most of that vocabulary has been replaced, that the landscape of Canada is now covered with names derived from European languages and European traditions of place naming, is one of the most concrete manifestations of what the colonial period did to the cultural landscape of the country. But the original names have not entirely disappeared. They survive in the knowledge of Indigenous communities. They survive in the linguistic and historical scholarship that has worked to recover and document them, and increasingly, they are being used again, appearing on maps and in official documents and in the everyday speech of people who want to acknowledge the deeper history of the places they name. The reappearance of Indigenous place names in the urban landscape of Canada is, in a small but meaningful way, a form of the same recovery that we have been discussing in the context of physical archaeology. It is the raising of what has been buried, the recovery of what has been covered over, the visible manifestation of the recognition that the places we inhabit have histories that go back much further than the names we gave them. The rivers of Canada are among the most significant features of the human geography of the continent, both before and after European contact. The great river systems, the St. Lawrence and its tributaries, the Ottawa, the Great Lakes and their outlet rivers, the Saskatchewan and Churchill systems of the prairies, the Mackenzie and its vast drainage basin in the northwest, the Fraser and Columbia on the Pacific slope. These were not simply natural features of the landscape, they were highways, they were boundaries, they were the organizing structure of the pre-contact human geography of the continent. The peoples who lived along those rivers knew them in a depth and detail that modern river management, with its dams and diversions and channelization, has largely obscured. They knew where the fish ran and when. They knew which stretches of water were navigable at different seasons and different water levels. They knew where the portages were, the places where the rivers became impassable, and the travel route required carrying the canoe overland to the next navigable stretch. They knew which tributary rivers led to what resources and what communities. They knew the rivers the way that people know things they have lived with for thousands of years, with a knowledge that goes far beyond the information on any map. The portage routes of the Canadian Shield are, in a very real sense, the original transportation infrastructure of the continent. Long before the first railway was driven through the rock of the Shield, long before the first highway was carved through the boreal forest, the portage routes of the canoe country were the pathways through which people and goods moved across the enormous distances of the interior. Those routes were not random, they were the product of generations of observation and experimentation, of gradually refining the most efficient paths through a complex landscape of lakes and rivers and forests and rock. Many of those portage routes are still in use today, by canoeists and kayakers who follow the same paths through the same landscape that pre-contact paddlers followed thousands of years ago. The persistence of those routes, their survival as practical travel paths across a landscape that has changed significantly around them, testifies to the quality of the knowledge that identified them in the first place. The best way through the Shield, the route that minimizes the total effort of travel while avoiding the most significant hazards, was worked out by pre-contact peoples over many generations, and it has not been significantly improved upon in the millennia since. The trading posts and fur trade routes that the French and then the British established in the interior of Canada followed, to a remarkable degree, the routes that pre-contact peoples had already established. The great fur trade canoe brigades that paddled from Montreal to the interior and back every year were following paths through the Shield landscape that had been in use for hundreds or thousands of years before the first European trader reached those waters. The knowledge of the routes came from Indigenous peoples who served as guides and partners in the early phases of the fur trade, and who carried in their heads a geographical understanding of the interior that no European map of the period could begin to match. The voyageurs who paddled those routes, the French Canadian and Métis and Indigenous men who formed the labour force of the fur trade, were themselves participants in a tradition of movement through the landscape that had deep pre-contact roots. The canoe that was their primary tool was not a European invention adapted to North American conditions. It was a North American invention, developed over thousands of years by the peoples who had been navigating the continent's waterways since long before any European arrived. The birch-bark canoe, with its extraordinary combination of lightness, strength, portability, and ease of repair, is one of the most elegant technological solutions to a specific environmental challenge that has ever been developed. And its development was the product of thousands of years of refinement by the peoples of the boreal forest and the Great Lakes region. The fur trade era, often treated as the beginning of Canadian economic history, was in fact built entirely on a foundation of indigenous knowledge and indigenous technology. The routes, the transportation technology, the understanding of the landscape, the knowledge of where the fur-bearing animals lived and how to take them, all of this came from the indigenous peoples who had been developing it for thousands of years before the first European trader arrived. The Europeans brought trade goods, the indigenous peoples brought everything else. That asymmetry, the degree to which European success in the interior of Canada depended on indigenous knowledge and technology, is not adequately reflected in the conventional narrative of Canadian history. The conventional narrative tends to place Europeans in the active role and indigenous peoples in the passive, as if the latter were simply a convenient source of labour and furs, rather than the actual architects of the economic system on which the early Canadian colonial economy depended. The correction of that narrative requires not just adding more detail to the story of the fur trade, but fundamentally reconsidering who the agents and innovators of that period actually were. The deep winter of the Canadian interior is a force that demands respect. Temperatures in the boreal forest can drop to -40 and stay there for weeks. The snowpack can reach 2 meters or more. The ground freezes to depths that make it impenetrable. The days are short and the nights are long, and the world contracts to the small circle of firelight and shelter. For the peoples who have lived in that environment across the millennia, winter was not simply an obstacle or a period of suffering to be endured until spring. It was a season with its own character, its own rhythms, its own demands, and its own gifts. The winter was when the ice roads opened, when travel that was impossible in summer across the boggy, lake-studded terrain of the Shield became possible on frozen surfaces. The winter was when certain animals were most efficiently hunted, when the fur-bearing species that the boreal forest is famous for were in the peak of their winter coats. The winter was when the community drew in on itself, when the social and ceremonial life that had been dispersed across the landscape by the demands of summer subsistence activities was concentrated in the winter encampment. The knowledge that allowed people to survive and even thrive in those winter conditions is of a kind that it is genuinely difficult for someone raised in a heated building in a modern city to fully appreciate. The reading of snow conditions, the understanding of how to construct shelter that provides adequate insulation against extreme cold using only materials available in the boreal environment, the knowledge of how to maintain body temperature through movement and clothing, and the careful management of caloric expenditure, the understanding of how animals behave in winter, where they are to be found, how their behavior changes in response to cold and snow and the shortened days. All of that knowledge was developed over thousands of years of trial and error, of survival and failure, of the slow accumulation of understanding that comes from living in a place across many generations. And all of it is encoded in the oral traditions, the material culture, the place names, and the landscape modifications of the peoples who developed it. It is another form of the buried history that we have been exploring tonight. Not buried underground in the same sense as the archaeological record, but buried in forms that the conventional educational and institutional frameworks of Canadian society have been very slow to recognize as the sophisticated knowledge systems they actually are. The recognition of Indigenous knowledge systems as genuine knowledge, as forms of understanding the world that have genuine epistemic validity and that deserve to be taken seriously in contemporary decision-making about the landscape and its management, is one of the most significant intellectual shifts currently occurring in Canadian public discourse. It is a shift that has practical implications for how forests are managed, how fish stocks are assessed, how fire is used or suppressed in the boreal ecosystem, how climate change and its effects on northern landscapes are understood and responded to. And it is also a shift that has implications for how we understand the buried history of the landscape, because the knowledge systems that encode the deep past of the Canadian landscape are not only in the ground, they are in the minds and the practices and the oral traditions of the peoples who have maintained them across the generations. Those peoples are the most direct access we have to the deep history of this place. And learning to take that access seriously, learning to engage with what it offers with the same rigor and the same openness that we bring to the material record in the ground, is part of the work of finally showing what has been beneath the surface all along. The night has gone deep now. The city outside, wherever you are, has grown quiet. The traffic has thinned. The voices have faded. In the small hours before dawn, the human world becomes briefly more transparent, the built environment temporarily less assertive, and it becomes possible to feel, just faintly, the presence of the much longer history that underlies it. The feeling is not nostalgia. It is not romanticization of the past or sentimentalization of what was lost. It is something more like calibration, the recognition of where we actually are in the long timeline of human engagement with this landscape, the recognition that the century and a half of urban development that has covered the pre-contact past of Canada's cities is not the beginning of the story, but one relatively recent episode in a story that stretches back 12,000 years. That recognition changes things. It changes the way the ground feels underfoot. It changes the way the landscape reads. It changes the scale of obligation that feels appropriate when making decisions about the built environment and what it covers and what it destroys and what it might, with care and intention, preserve. The streets of every Canadian city were raised. The practice of raising those streets, of physically elevating the urban surface above the natural ground level, was a literal and practical response to the challenges of urban development in a climate that presented specific drainage and sanitation problems. But it was also, metaphorically and in its effects, a raising of the built world above the pre-built world, a gesture, unintentional but consequential, of covering over. What is beneath has never been fully shown, not because the information is not there. It is there, in the ground, in the oral traditions, in the landscape modifications that survived the development era, in the collections of objects stored in the basements of museums, in the site reports filed in government archives, in the knowledge held by Indigenous communities across the country. The information is there. The challenge has been the frameworks, the tools, the will, and the humility required to receive it. Those frameworks are developing, those tools are improving, that will is growing, and the humility, the recognition that what the conventional narrative has said about the pre-contact past of Canada is radically incomplete, is, among those who are paying attention, becoming more widely shared. The streets will be raised again in future construction cycles. New layers of the built environment will be laid down over the layers that exist today. The city will continue to deepen itself, to accumulate new strata above the old ones. That is the nature of urban development. It moves forward. It buries the past under the weight of the present and the future. But the past that is being buried now is a past that, increasingly, we have the tools to document before it disappears. The salvage archaeology that is conducted ahead of development, when the regulatory frameworks require it, and when it is implemented with adequate resources and expertise, is creating a record of what is being disturbed, that the development era of the 19th and early 20th centuries failed to create. That record is imperfect. It is incomplete. It is, in many cases, far less thorough than it should be, given the significance of what is being disturbed. But it exists. It is growing. It is, in its accumulation, beginning to constitute a meaningful archive of the buried past of Canada's cities. And in that growing archive, the story of what lies beneath the raised streets is slowly becoming more fully legible. The depth of the human history of this landscape is becoming more accurately known. The sophistication and the complexity and the richness of the pre-contact past are becoming more widely understood. The peoples whose ancestors created that past are finding their voices heard in forums and conversations that for too long excluded them. The showing of what is beneath has begun. It is incomplete. It will remain incomplete. There is too much that has already been lost beyond recovery. too much that will never be known because it was destroyed before anyone thought to look carefully at what was being destroyed. But what remains is still extraordinary, still capable of transforming, in meaningful ways, the understanding that Canadians have of the place they call home. So lie here now, in the deep night, and feel the weight of the earth beneath you. Feel the depth of the history it holds. Feel the patience with which it has been waiting for the understanding above it to catch up with what it contains. The streets were raised. The past was covered. The history went underground. But underground is not gone. Underground is waiting. And the waiting, after 12,000 years of it, is nearly over. Good night. The ground beneath you holds 10,000 stories. They will still be there in the morning. Before we close entirely tonight, there is one more thread that deserves to be pulled, one more dimension of the buried story of Canada's landscape that has not yet been fully addressed. It is the most speculative dimension, the one that lives at the edge of what the archaeological record can definitively support, and it concerns the possibility that some of what lies beneath the streets of Canadian cities may be genuinely, unexpectedly ancient in ways that challenge the conventional understanding of when humans first arrived on this continent. The question of when people first reached the Americas is one of the most actively debated questions in North American archaeology. For most of the 20th century, the dominant view was that the Americas were first peopled approximately 13,000 years ago, when the ancestors of indigenous Americans came through an ice-free corridor between the retreating Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets and spread rapidly southward through the continent. The Clovis culture, named for a distinctive stone tool technology, first identified at a site near Clovis, New Mexico, was taken to be the archaeological signature of that initial peopling event. The Clovis first model had considerable evidence in its favor and dominated the field for decades. But it has been under sustained pressure for the past 30 years, as a growing number of archaeological sites across the Americas have produced evidence of human occupation predating the Clovis period. Some of those sites are in South America, far to the south of where a population entering through the Beringia corridor would have been expected to reach so quickly. Some are in coastal areas that suggest the Kelp Highway route along the Pacific coast, and some are in unexpected locations across North America that simply do not fit the conventional picture. The site of Calvert Island, on the central coast of British Columbia, where researchers found human footprints preserved in sediment and dated to approximately 13,000 years ago, is one of the most striking recent discoveries. The footprints, both adult and child, were found in a context that suggests the people who made them were living on the coast during the period when sea levels were lower than today, before the post-glacial rise in sea level covered the landscape on which they walked. They are among the oldest confirmed human footprints in the Americas, and they are in Canada. The implications of the Calvert Island footprints, combined with other evidence from coastal British Columbia and from sites further south along the Pacific coast, is that people were on the Pacific coast of North America at least as long ago as the Clovis period, and probably longer. The Kelp Highway model, which proposes that the first Americans moved rapidly down the Pacific coast following the productive marine ecosystem, gains significant support from these coastal discoveries. But there are sites in the Americas, and some in Canada specifically, that suggest dates considerably older than 13,000 years. The Bluefish Caves in the Yukon, a series of limestone cavities near the Bluefish River in what was the Beringia refugium during the last glacial maximum, have produced faunal remains that show what some researchers interpret as cut marks made by stone tools. The dates on those faunal remains go back to between 24,000 and 30,000 years ago. If the cut marks are genuine, if they were indeed made by human tools rather than by some natural process, then people were present in the Yukon during the last glacial maximum, 20,000 years before the conventional Clovis first model would allow. The Bluefish Caves evidence is controversial. The interpretation of the cut marks as human-made has been challenged by some researchers who argue that they could have been produced by natural carnivore activity or by geological processes. The debate is ongoing and has not been definitively resolved, but the possibility raised by that evidence, that human presence in the Yukon and potentially in the broader Canadian landscape, goes back significantly further than the conventional timeline suggests, is one that the research community is taking more seriously than it would have 20 years ago. If human presence in Canada goes back further than 13,000 years, the implications for understanding what lies beneath the streets of Canada's cities are significant. The buried layers beneath those streets would contain, at their very deepest levels accessible before bedrock, evidence of human occupation from periods that would require fundamental revision of our understanding of the peopling of the Americas. The archaeology of Canadian cities would become, potentially, the archaeology of the very first Americans, or something even more ancient. That possibility is speculative. The evidence is not sufficient, at this point, to assert it with confidence. The archaeology of the Yukon's pre-glacial occupations is still in its early stages, and the implications of whatever is found there for the archaeological record of the urban landscape further south are far from clear. But the history of archaeology in Canada is a history of the conventional timeline being pushed back. Again and again, the dates at which human presence in various parts of the country has been documented have been pushed earlier than previously believed, as new methods of investigation and new approaches to interpreting the evidence have been applied. The ground has been consistently more ancient than the conventional narrative predicted. There is every reason to believe that as investigation continues, as the buried layers of the Canadian landscape are more thoroughly examined by more sophisticated tools, the antiquity of human presence here will continue to be revised upward. The streets were raised over a past that was already deep when the first foundations were laid. How deep, exactly, is a question that the research of the coming decades may finally be in a position to answer. One of the most moving experiences available in the Canadian landscape is to stand in a place where the pre-contact past becomes briefly, viscerally present, where the accumulated weight of thousands of years of human occupation makes itself felt not as an abstract historical fact, but as something more immediate, something closer to encounter. Those places exist. They are not always the obvious ones, the heritage sites with interpretive panels and parking lots. Sometimes they are completely unmarked, known only to people who know to look for them. A particular bend in a river, where the evidence of a fish weir, the stone structures built by pre-contact peoples to channel fish into a confined space for easier harvesting, is still visible in the water at low tide. A hillside in the Shield Country, where a pattern of stone clearings reflects the organized use of the landscape by people who lived there hundreds of years ago. A stretch of coastline in British Columbia, where the shell middens of a pre-contact village form a slight elevation of the ground, not obvious to an untrained eye, but unmistakable once you know what you are looking at. In those places, the distance between the present and the past collapses. The people who stood in the same spot thousands of years ago, who looked at the same river bend, or the same hillside, or the same stretch of coast, become briefly less remote. Their presence in the landscape becomes briefly perceptible, not in a supernatural sense, in a very ordinary, very human sense. The sense that comes from recognizing that other people not essentially different from you, have been in the same place doing the same kinds of things that all humans do everywhere and always, and that their traces are still there, in the land, waiting to be noticed. The raising of the streets covered most of those places in the cities, sealed them under concrete and asphalt and the weight of urban development, made them inaccessible except to the few who have the tools and the training to reach through the covering to what lies beneath. But the covering is not complete, the erasure is not total. In the ravines and the river valleys and the remnant wetlands that have escaped development, in the archaeological sites that have been protected or simply overlooked, in the waterways that still run approximately where they ran before the cities came, the pre-contact landscape persists, diminished, fragmented, often barely recognizable, but present, and in the minds and the knowledge and the living traditions of the Indigenous peoples of Canada, the pre-contact landscape persists in a form that no amount of urban development has been able to erase. The knowledge of what the landscape was, of how it worked, of what it meant to the communities who inhabited it across the millennia, is carried in those traditions with a fidelity and a depth that no archaeological report and no official historical narrative has been able to match. The streets were raised. What is beneath them has never been fully shown, but the showing is happening. It is happening in the archaeology and in the scholarship and in the conversations between researchers and Indigenous communities, and in the slowly changing legal and institutional frameworks that govern the management of heritage in Canada. It is happening in the growing public interest in the deep history of this place, It is happening in the reconnection of indigenous communities with ancestral places that development had covered but had never entirely severed. It is a slow process. It is an incomplete process. It will never fully recover what was lost in the century and a half of development that sealed the buried record of 12,000 years of human occupation beneath the infrastructure of modern Canadian cities. But it is real, it is growing, and what it reveals, as it proceeds, is remarkable. Consistently, reliably, at every depth and in every context where investigation has been possible, the ground yields evidence that the conventional narrative of Canada's pre-contact past has been inadequate to its subject. The subject is enormous. It is 12,000 years of human life on a landscape of extraordinary diversity and richness. It is hundreds of generations of communities adapting, developing, innovating, and transmitting their knowledge across the vast stretch of time that separates the first post-glacial arrivals from the moment when the first European ships appeared on the horizon. It is the full complexity and sophistication and beauty of the human engagement with this place across all of that time. That is what lies beneath the streets. That is what the raised urban surfaces cover. That is the buried history that is slowly, painfully, incompletely coming back into the light. It is a history worth knowing, a history worth the effort of uncovering, a history that, when it is finally more fully known, will change the way this country understands itself and the land it calls home. The night is ending. Somewhere, the light is beginning to return. The long darkness, the long patience of the underground gives way, eventually, to the possibility of illumination. What has been buried comes up. What has been covered is revealed. What was lost, even the parts that can be recovered, begin to be recovered. Sleep deeply tonight. Let the long history settle around you. The ground knows what it holds, and it has been waiting, patiently, for you to be ready to know it too. There is one thing more to say before silence. It concerns the children. Every generation of people who has lived on this landscape, from the very first post-glacial arrivals 12,000 years ago to the families living in Canadian cities today, has included children. Children who played near the fires and in the river shallows and along the edge of the forest. Children who were taught the names of plants and the habits of animals and the stories that explained how the world worked and what their place in it was. Children who looked at the same stars that are above you now and asked the same questions that children have always asked about what lies beyond what can be seen. Those children grew up. They became the adults who carried the knowledge forward, who raised their own children in the same landscapes their parents had raised them, who added their own observations and innovations to the accumulated inheritance of understanding that their community maintained. And then they died, as everyone dies, and their knowledge passed into the tradition that their children and grandchildren would carry, and their bones passed into the ground. The bones of those children are in the ground beneath the cities. Not all of them, not most of them. Too much has been disturbed and destroyed. But some of them, in the pockets of undisturbed soil, in the burial sites that escaped the worst of the development era's depredations, in the places where the earth was lucky enough to be left alone, the physical remains of 12,000 years of childhood on this landscape are preserved. Small bones, tiny ribs and finger bones, and the delicate arches of small skulls. The evidence, as clear and as moving as any evidence in the archaeological record, that this land was home. That it was not wilderness in the sense that colonial settlement used that word. That it was, for thousands of years, a place where children were born and grew and played and learned and eventually grew old and died. That is what lies beneath the streets, among everything else, among the tools and the hearths and the middens and the post molds and all the other archaeological signatures of organized human life across the millennia. Among all of that, the bones of children who played in these places before the cities covered them. Knowing that changes the quality of the silence underground. It is not simply the silence of undisturbed geological strata. It is not simply the silence of stored information waiting for the tools to read it. It is the silence of lives fully lived, of communities fully formed, of a human presence on this land that was, for all its difference from the present, fully as real and fully as significant and fully as deserving of acknowledgement as anything that has happened here since. The streets were raised. What is beneath them is extraordinary. What is beneath them is, in the deepest sense, the real beginning of the Canadian story. Not 1,534, not 1,608, not 1,749, not 1,867, 12,000 years ago, when the first people arrived on the post-glacial landscape and looked around at the world that had been left to them by the retreating ice, and began, as humans always begin, the slow, patient work of learning to live. That work is still going on. It will always be going on. Because the living of life on a landscape is never finished, never complete, never fully understood by those who are doing it. Every generation adds its layer to the accumulating record of human engagement with this place. Every generation buries, beneath its own presence, the presence of those who came before. The streets will be raised again, the cities will deepen further into the earth. More layers will be added above what is already there. The past will become more buried, not less, as time goes on. But the past is not gone, the past is underground, and in the dark, in the patient earth beneath your feet, it holds what it has always held, the evidence of every life that was ever lived on this land, the proof that this was always home, the testimony that the human story here goes back much, much further than anyone standing on the surface, looking at the raised streets of a modern Canadian city, might ever think to imagine. Rest now, the stories will keep. They have been keeping for 12,000 years. They will keep for 12,000 more. And somewhere in that long keeping, perhaps, everything that was buried will finally be shown.